I had gone only a short way when a voice called me over. I turned and found senior brother Nagun tucked up in the canopy of a tree, watching me with an odd, secretive look. He dropped down, glanced left and right, and asked in a low voice whether the master had just told me to seek out the senior brother whenever I ran into trouble with my cultivation technique. I nodded, not yet following where he meant to lead. He said it had been the same for him in the old days, and told me to remember to bring something along when I paid my first call. No one had warned him back then, he said, and he had been frozen out by everyone for a long stretch. A truly miserable feeling. My brows drew together. So a first meeting gift was required, and skipping it meant the whole group would shun me. I asked how much I would need to give. He said 101 was the floor, that anything less and the senior brother would tell me there was no need between fellow disciples. Giving it would only be doing him a harm, he added, and the number seemed almost to pain him as he named it. My eyes narrowed. If the first call alone cost 101, was I to pay by the visit every time I asked after my technique afterward? I asked in a low voice whether the master knew of any of this. He said he could not say whether the master was aware. He knew only that last time he had given it, the senior brother had pushed it back for a long while before reluctantly taking it, saying he would hold on to it for him for now. Nagun gave me a look that said I surely understood how these things went. The word hold was aptly chosen. Looking at Guak Rimsan's thick brows and big honest eyes, that plain and simple face, I would never have guessed I had misread the man so badly. Nagun winked and told me not to breathe a word, that it was he who had tipped me off. He said he would go on ahead, and that next time I was free, the two of us should visit the Treihong Pavilion together. I watched him leave, stood there thinking a moment, and then went to bring Ji Dokbong in. After I handed over the medicine and the herbs, I asked how the stall was faring, and to my relief, no one had been trailing Ji Dokbong of late. He told me a few more pill stalls had opened along that street, that he had gone to look and the wares were varied, and the quality not bad. I could not help laughing, since none of that did us the slightest harm. More sellers looked on the surface like a threat to our sales, and might even drag the price down. Yet I wanted as many such stalls as could crowd in, because every one of them made it less likely that anyone would fix their eyes on Jitel Bong. And the Chungryong pill, I turned out, sat near the very peak of its kind in both body and effect. A single purchase was enough for a buyer to learn the difference, so my pills would keep moving smoothly. Once I had seen Ji Delpong off, I spent 3 hours finishing the day's refining, most of it Qiangryong pill, with a few Jiangbu pill mixed in for my own use. Then I stepped outside, glanced up at the sky, hesitated a beat, and made for Guak Rimsan's quarters. His rooms were a good deal finer than what a freshly admitted disciple like me rated. He looked a little surprised to see me at his door, but welcomed me in warmly all the same, and an hour later saw me back out. He praised my comprehension ability as truly out of the ordinary. He said I had picked out in a single night the hard points of the Tongwan technique that no one who had not drilled it for years could even detect. In the same breath, he sighed over my low cultivation, only just into the bone forging realm. He told me to redouble my efforts and break through to the marrow refining realm as soon as I could, or the road ahead would only grow steeper under me. I thanked him for his guidance, and told him not to trouble himself walking me any further. He added, almost as an afterthought, that in a few days a sect task had come down to our branch. Green as I was, he said, I would still have to go along when the time came, and he would tell me more of it when he had a moment. I echoed the word, caught off guard, but I nodded all the same. There had been no gift, no hazing, no runaround. Whatever I asked, Guak Rimsan answered plainly, one point at a time, as far as his own knowledge stretched. At one moment I had tried to press a few local trifles on him, and his face had changed on the spot. It was the face of a man who could not abide a single grain of sand in his eye. So what exactly was Nagun after? Trying to get me thrashed by Guak Rimsan? I turned his morning words over and frowned, since had I truly forced a gift on the man, I might well have been thrown straight out on my ear. I decided to have a quiet word with Nagun that night. This sort of thing simply would not stand. Night fell. That night I knocked. Nagun's voice came through thick and irritable, demanding who called at such an hour. He hauled the door open, and before he could place my face in the dark, I drove my fist into his cheek. He flinched and threw up a guard on instinct, but I had banked on exactly that, and slid my line past his arm, and he went down hard. Before he could rise, I dropped a sack over him, slammed his own door, and set to work. He bawled that someone dared lay hands on a man inside the Wanjin sword sect, that they must not want to live, and clawed at the cloth. So I gave him a steady rain of blows, all of it aimed at his head and face, the injuries light and the pain enormous. His tough words melted into shrieks, and he begged me to stop, swearing he had never once wronged whoever I was, though he had no notion at all who I was. He fainted more than once, and the pain kept dragging him back up to be beaten again. I stopped in the end, when I judged the lesson learned. By the time he clawed the sack off, his face would be one his own mother could not have named, and I did not stay for the weeping. It must have hurt. Ever since that good talk, I did not lay eyes on Na-gun for days on end. Perhaps he had realized he was in the wrong, and was too ashamed to show his face. In the meantime, I ground away at the first level of the Tongwan technique, and went now and then to consult Guok Rimson. I always asked after the key points buried deep in the technique, the sort no one who had not cultivated far could ever grasp. He answered every time with real relish. He was like a master of hard problems, insulted by the easy questions and delighted by the profound ones he happened to know. Each visit not only showed off his skill and gave him the pleasure of teaching, but also drew the two of us steadily closer. He had come to admire my comprehension ability while sighing endlessly over my aptitude, the same curiosity that had once moved Peng Supo to test me. This time there was no need to test anything, since I had told him the plain result outright. He said that if I only carried Na-gun's aptitude, my cultivation would already stand at the marrow refining realm at the very least, perhaps past his own. I smiled and asked whether the Tongwan technique did not keep raising a man's cultivation speed the further he took it. He said it did, but that it only grew harder the deeper he went, and that he had sat stalled at the 5th level for close to 2 years. Only by carrying the Tongwan technique to its 5th level and reaching the organ refining realm in the flesh, could a man contend for the standing of true disciple. Only then could he truly touch the legacy of the Wenjin sword sect. We did not match the Sonon sword sect in top legacy or in top strength, he said. But that did not make us weak, only meant the Sonon sword sect was simply too strong. I did not linger on that and asked instead about the mission he had mentioned. He roused himself and said cheerfully that it was nothing hard, that the Sonon sword sect needed medicinal materials to refine their pills, and had asked several schools to gather and deliver them. It struck me as strange that we should be made to collect for another sect, and I said so. He nodded as though it were the most natural thing in the world, saying that ever since he joined, whenever the Sonon sword sect wanted something done, they simply handed it to us. The corner of my eye twitched. So it had been going on a long while. Given the Sionon sword sect's strength, they could have swallowed every resource around Sionon City. Yet they let schools like the Wenjin sword sect go on existing. And why, if not so that a single order could always find someone to do the work? At least they were not demanding finished pills, I said. Sionon City sat right against the mountains, so herbs were thick on the ground and gathering them was no trouble at all. He shook his head and told me the Sonon sword sect did not trust our alchemy and wanted only the raw materials. I blinked. So it was not that they had held back from squeezing us harder, it was purely that they looked down on our craft. They disliked our low standard, and would rather take the raw stuff and handle it themselves. There was nothing at all wrong with that logic. Since pills were already on the table, I decided to raise a worry of my own. After these few days together, I had a fair read on Guok Rimson, a blunt, plain-spoken, thoroughly upright man. I told him I could refine pills and usually had someone sell them for me in Sionon City, and that over the long run I did not know whether some jealous party might make trouble. He raised an eyebrow. Though remembering the comprehension I had shown, alchemy did not seem so unlikely a thing in me. In any case, alchemists were hardly rare, the Wenjin sword sect keeping many full-time ones, with some intersect disciples dabbling on the side. Most of the dabblers were nothing special, of course, since alchemy tested talent the same as martial arts did. I told him I could turn out a passable Changryong pill, and this time he was genuinely surprised, since among the side dabblers even that counted as impressive. He thought a moment and said that selling pills in Sionon City generally carried no danger, being under the Sonon sword sect's rule, but that if I was truly worried there was a safe road. When I asked what it was, he said to join the Alchemists Alliance, a place formed by alchemists gathering together. He picked up his tea, took a sip, and told me it had been founded more than 100 years back by a loose cultivator. That founder had felt loose cultivator alchemists were forever being pushed around, and so had started a mutual aid society that had grown across the century in today's alliance. My eyes lit. Gathering information before, I had chased only school matters and overlooked this entirely. Other cities had no such alliance or anything like it, so a fixed habit of mind had blinded me to it. Better late than never. I asked whether joining would win me the alliance's protection. He said of course it would, or what use would the thing be, and it was more than protection besides. A very holy land where alchemists traded knowledge and bettered themselves. Its present alliance leader was Wei Hyung-san, the peak master of the Pill Peak of the Sonon sword sect. My expression flickered at a backing that heavy. As for how an alliance meant for loose cultivator alchemists had ended with a schoolman seated at its head, that was all but inevitable. Seeing me eager, he laughed and told me not to get ahead of myself, that there were requirements to join. I guessed age, and he laughed harder and asked what age limit alchemists would ever have. He said instead that a man had to refine pills of a certain standard to get in, and that many in our own school could not. I tidied myself, left the school, went back into Sonon City, and found Ji Dokbong, and before long the two of us had located the alliance. Watching the headquarters in the distance with its steady tide of coming and going, Ji-Dokbong spoke in a low voice. He said that if we could get in, we would never again have to fret over selling pills. He knew I could refine the Janbu pill, which fetched a far higher price than the Chungryong pill. In a city the size of Sonun City, no quantity of them would be hard to move. It was a great heap of money he had never dared reach for before, and now the chance had finally come. At the gate a guard stopped us, calling out that non-alchemists were not to enter. I cupped my hands and said I was an alchemist come to join. He gave me a look and said the Alliance took only those who passed a test, and asked whether we both were alchemists. Ji-Dokbong said quickly that he was only my friend, and the guard told him to wait outside, that once I passed I could bring my people in. Ji-Dokbong nodded and crossed to sit in the tea house opposite, and I followed the guard through the main gate. Inside, people wove past one another in a constant stream, many of them deep in talk over the fine points of alchemy. A faint medicinal scent hung over it all, as though I had stepped into one enormous alchemy room. The guard led me to a female deacon, who asked whether I had come to sit the Alliance test. I said I had, and asked what it required. Jin Jonggran nodded, a warm smile on her face, and said that with so many lately wanting in, the bar had been raised a little. I would have to be of excellent quality. The moment I heard it, I perked up and asked whether I could test that same day. She said I had to apply first, and that there was a fee of 1,001, refunded if I passed and kept for the Alliance's development if I did not. My expression flickered. Clearly it was meant to keep those without the strength from testing on a whim and wasting the Alliance's people and resources. I said that was fine and did not object. She gestured me toward the counter, where the application dragged through payment and registration. Then she walked me to a row of alchemy rooms, several of the doors shut tight with people surely refining behind them. She reminded me again that a first failure meant a half-year wait and a doubled fee, and asked whether I had thought it through. I thanked her for the reminder. She led me into one of the rooms and told me to refine a Chungryong pill within half an hour, that running past the limit meant failure. I glanced around at the herbs heaped and mixed together, plainly left for the alchemist to sort out for himself. I looked back at her, and she raised the image recording stone in her hand as the signal to begin. The stone would stay with the Alliance afterward for review at any time, she said, a guard against favoritism and cheating. I found the herbs I needed among the clutter with no trouble, cleaned the pill furnace on the floor, lit the fire, and set the furnace. I waited for it to heat through before tipping in every ingredient the Changryong pill called for. Jin Jongbran's brows knit. My steps were not wrong, but my movements ran too broad and too rough, and the order was a mess, since who dumps everything in at once? Worse still, the flame under the furnace was far too high. Alchemy lived on control of the heat, and a big flame refined faster but sent the difficulty climbing sharply. That was why the test allowed a full half hour, so no one need rush. Slow work yielding the fine result. She had all but decided this batch of mine would blow the furnace open. I knew nothing of what she was thinking, and simply held to my own rhythm, working my internal energy to steer the shifting properties inside the furnace without a pause. It was the best method I had ever drilled myself, the one that gave the fastest yield without costing quality. Whether it suited anyone else I could not say, but it suited me. Without it, I could never have finished close to 100 Chongryong pills a day in a few short hours, even at a high success rate. What I chased was speed. As she waited for the blast, threads of medicinal fragrance began to drift across the room. She sniffed, surprised, since this was not the smell of a furnace about to burst. And after so many years around pills, she even began to think the batch might come out very fine. Her gaze changed as it rested on me. Alchemy could not be faked, and setting her first bias aside, she washed my hands again and found them nimble and free. Everything handled with an easy grace. A little past a quarter of an hour, I brought my palm down on the furnace lid with a muffled thud that startled her. I took the pills out, laid them on a nearby plate, and handed them over, asking whether they would do. She looked at the plump, jade-bright Changryong pills on the porcelain and could not hide her admiration. A pill of that standard demanded complete mastery of the pill formula, or it could not be made at all. She had watched many tests, she said, and could count on one hand the time she had seen Chongryong pills like these, and the sharpest point of it was how fast I had worked. It still needed verifying, she said, bowing slightly and putting the stone away, her manner much altered as she asked me to follow her. I trailed her to a counter where she handed over the plate and the stone, and after about the burning of an incense stick, both were checked and passed. The Alliance staff confirmed my details and set a jade token down before me, telling me it was my proof of standing within the Alliance and to keep it safe. I took it and looked at the pill furnace carved into the jade, and could not help smiling. At last I had a background and a backing, and could start selling the Jangbu pill without fear of someone turning up at my door. I asked whether the Alliance sold pill formulas. She shook her head, saying they did not, but that I could exchange for them with the Alliance's contribution points. Those were earned by finishing tasks the Alliance handed out, she explained, or by turning in a pill formula I had worked out myself, rewarded after an assessment. Points bought formulas, and with enough of them a man could even post tasks of his own, so long as the content harmed no one. It came to me then that this was much like a school, all of it built to bind the loyalty of the people below. It is a hard thing to trade a pile of free favors for gratitude any other way. I asked whether there was any difference in standing between a man who could refine the Chongryong pill and one who could refine the Jiangbu pill. Of course there was, she said. If I could refine the Jiangbu pill and it passed for quality and effect, I would rise from a 9th grade alchemist to an 8th grade alchemist. Some alliance tasks were closed to any but high-grade hands. Her eyes were bright on me now, with something new stirring behind them. I was a young 8th grade alchemist, a bit dark but tall and straight, and on a closer look not bad at all to rest the eye on. So they graded their alchemists too. Sensible enough, since the Jiangbu pill ate far more herbs than the Chongryong pill and its difficulty climbed sharply, which drew a clean line between the two levels and made the alliance easier to run. I told her I wanted to apply for the 8th grade test. Through all this long stretch of turning out Chongryong pills, I had ground my Jiangbu pill proficiency to great perfection ages ago. It was time to show what I could do. She asked me to wait while she reported it, and was gone a good while before she came back and asked me to follow. We reached the alchemy room to find an old alchemist already waiting, the 8th grade test being the stricter for his presence. She told me softly that I could begin, and whether or not it was my own fancy, her voice seemed much gentler than it had a moment before, pleasant to the ear. Against Jin Zhonggran's warm face, the old alchemist Dan Jiaol was blank as stone. For the 8th grade assessment, an extra man was added to keep it rigorous, and Dan Jiaol, being an 8th grade alchemist himself, was more than fit to examine. Still, at the sight of my young face, the corner of his mouth twitched. Among martial artists, I fell into the older youth bracket, only lately into the bone forging realm, looked down on by the great schools around Seonan City as a disciple of little promise. Among alchemists, though, I was young, since alchemy leaned on comprehension and on experience alike. A man who aged could at least sum up his own practice until it turned perfect where his comprehension fell short. Dan Jiaol's own gift for alchemy was middling, but the years had made him very good at the Jiangbu pill and its like. The Biryong pill he could only manage now and then, at a low success rate and poor quality. So a face as young as mine sitting the 8th grade test left him faintly out of sorts. This was the more so as more and more of my age had been turning up for it of late. I picked my herbs, lit the fire, set the furnace as always, and threw everything in. The scorching flame licked the base while I steered the properties with my internal energy, and in no time the fragrance rose. Jin Zhonggran watched with shining eyes, for what she had taken at first for rough handling now read plainly as free and deliberate. A man with a plan set firm in his chest. Next to the overly cautious, this is what alchemy ought to look like. Dan Jiaol caught the scent, and his eyes shifted. This would be a fine batch of Jiangbu pills. No worse than the standard he had held for decades, and better in a few respects. A little past a quarter of an hour I brought my palm down on the lid, and the clean fragrance sharpened. Dan Jiaol could not stop himself stepping up, and at the sight of the Jiangbu pills lying quiet in the furnace, a trace of amazement crossed his face. She asked in a low voice whether it had worked. He said they should test it later, but he saw no trouble, took the plate and studied the pills close. He found them refined better than his own, their effect drawing the full potential out of the Jiangbu pill. He looked up and asked whether I cared to go on with the assessment. A man who refined the Jiangbu pill to this pitch had likely laid too solid a foundation for his Biryong pill to come out poor. Her eyes went wide. She wondered whether I might be fit for the 7th grade test. A 7th grade alchemist, even in the vastness of Seonan City, was a person of rank, far more honored than an ordinary martial artist of the organ refining realm. I shook my head and said I had no pill formula for the Biryong pill. I had read through many medical texts and bought Biryong pills to pick apart some time ago, but working the formula backward had not gone smoothly. At my present pace, I would need another half year at least to truly deduce it, and that only if things ran fairly smooth. Dan Jiaol nodded in understanding, since loose cultivator alchemists from the outlands rarely held the Biryong formula. Anyone with that much skill would never reach Seonan City, hemmed in as they would be by noble families back home. I asked whether the senior would be willing to sell me the Biryong formula. Since a ready-made one was best, the price soon earned back once I could refine the thing myself. He shook his head and said his own had been exchanged at the Alliance, and private trade was forbidden. She put in quickly that formulas taken with contribution points inside the Alliance could not be traded privately between alchemists, and that both parties would be punished hard if it ever came out. I nodded, since it made sense. Allow private trade and the contribution points meant nothing, and no alchemist would bother finishing the Alliance's tasks, and the whole thing would soon become a joke. He told me that beyond exchanging at the Alliance, I might also join some noble family for the Biryong formula, and offered to introduce a few if I liked. I thought a moment and shook my head, thanking him but saying I had no mind to join a noble family for now. The school was only a larger noble family, and I was already in the Wanjin sword sect, where I could exchange for a formula if I truly wanted one. The alliance here was another good road out besides. Joining someone else's noble family would only bring a tangle of strings, and getting a formula a little sooner was hardly worth that trouble. He nodded, told me to come find him if I ever changed my mind, and turned away. She bowed and brought me to the counter with the plate and the stone. The verification ran long, and after they asked Danjiel's view, and he raised no objection, my 8th grade assessment passed. The still-warm jade token was taken back and swapped for one of another make, finer than the last, its ringed cloud patterns far denser. I put it away and asked whether I might use the Alliance's mark, since I usually sold my pills around North Street. She had been watching me intently, and when I turned to her all at once, her face went red. She said with her head lowered that the Alliance kept special medicine bottles no outside alchemist was allowed, so that others would know at a glance a member when they saw one. Was this woman so taken with my looks that she should be blushing like that? A quarter of an hour later, I stepped out of the Alliance and found Ji Deokbong, who asked at once how it had gone. While he waited, he had made his own inquiries and gotten a rough sense of the Alliance's weight. He had learned that once a man was an alchemist the Alliance recognized, ordinary powers would not go out of their way to trouble him. A small matter like selling pills on North Street need never turn into another Hyunbun city, and the Alliance carried real weight all around Seonun City. I told him that from now on he could take my jade token to the Alliance for medicine bottles, and there should be no more trouble. A smile spread over my face. Trading the Chongryong pill for the Jongbu pill meant a little longer over each batch, and a slightly smaller yield per furnace. Even so, after the herb cost my daily take for the same time and effort, would clear 1,001. Better yet, that 1,000 and more came with nothing to fear. By this reckoning, I was about to grow very rich. The suppressing dragon elephant I had kept buried away at last had a hope of being cultivated. I needed only save a little over a month, and I could lift the veil on that cultivation technique's true face. Ji Dokbong looked at the token in his hand and smiled without meaning to, since we sat in the same boat now, and the better I fared, the better he would fare with me. A few days slid past. Beyond the daily alchemy, I spent most of my time grinding the proficiency of the Tongwon technique, and after many days of it, I finally maxed the first level. The panel called it full, 1,000 out of 1,000. I tested the cultivation effect once it reached perfection, setting aside what the pills gave me since that did not change, and measured against the technique alone it had risen by roughly a tenth. It was not striking, since I leaned mainly on swallowing pills each day for my quick gains, but this was only the first level, so a thin effect was no surprise at all. I knocked at Guak Rimsan's door with a jug of wine in hand, ordinary wine from an inn in Seonun City. He had a fondness for this exact taste, and pricier wine simply did not suit his palate. He opened the door and could not help smiling at the sight of the jug, several visits having left him well disposed toward me. He said just coming was enough, that there was no need to bring anything, and welcomed me inside. I told him I had troubled him with so many questions that I owed him at least a little wine to wet his throat, and set the jug on the table. He dug out 2 bowls and poured, and the smell alone widened his smile. He liked this wine. After a few sips, I found my opening and asked why the master had taught me only the Tongwon technique, and when the sword and movement techniques would come. Taking me for worried that Peng Supo played favorites, he reassured me that the master treated everyone the same. Every month the master examined our progress in martial arts, and whoever performed well enough to seem able would be taught more. When I asked what counted as performing well, he said that for a newcomer like me, simply cultivating the Tongwon technique well was more than enough. I asked whether he meant taking the first level to perfection. He tipped his head back, drained his bowl, and said that yes, cultivating it to perfection would surely count. I asked whether that was so, and put out my hand, and my right forefinger began to turn faintly clear, as though a layer of light were about to break out of it. He still had wine in his mouth and nearly sprayed it at the strange sight. The Tongwon technique took its meaning from joining body and mind top to bottom. Cultivating the first level to its peak let a man drive force clear to his fingertips, which was exactly the thing I had just shown. He asked whether I had cultivated the Tongwon technique before, his first thought being that I must have, or how else so fast. I had been in the inner school only a handful of days and already maxed the first level, while he himself had spent a full month to bring it this far. Even then, Peng Supo had praised his comprehension and his fit with the technique. If a month meant good comprehension and a fine fit, what was a man who finished in a few days to be called a stunning talent? I shook my head with a smile and told him he was joking, that the Tongwon technique was an inner school technique and could hardly be circulating outside. The master had tested my aptitude when I first arrived, I added, and would long since have caught it had I already learned the thing. True enough, he allowed, nodding. The chance of a leak could not be ruled out, but was vanishingly small, and had I really learned it in secret, I would be too busy hiding the fact to flaunt it like this. Were it reported to Peng Supo, he would only test my internal energy again. The energy the Tongwan technique bred was distinct enough that it could scarcely be hidden from a man who had reached perfection at the 5th level. So had I truly maxed the 1st level in a few days? And if so, then with comprehension like that, even poor aptitude did not leave my future wholly without hope. He stood and told me to come find the master, walking out on the moment while I fell in behind. Before long we reached the courtyard and he called out loudly that disciple Guak Rimsen begged an audience. Peng Supo had not gone out that day and happened to be in the yard, and looked puzzled to see the two of us arrive together. Guak Rimsan stepped up and told him in a low voice that his junior brother had cultivated the 1st level of the Tongwan technique to perfection. Peng Supo went still and looked at me, and I put out my palm with all 5 fingers gone faintly luminous. Surprise crossed his eyes, his gut reaction the very same, that I had learned it before. But he threw the thought off at once. Recalling the comprehension I had shown with the Chowan sword, maxing the 1st level in a few days was not past belief, or else I was simply a rare fit for the Tongwan technique, of which the school had seen many cases across the years. He told us both to come in, took the secret manual for the 2nd level into the study, and there laid out the steps and the key points of it on the spot. An hour later when he had finished, I checked the panel, the 2nd level showing a single point against the 2000 it demanded. He asked in a low voice how many days I thought it would take to bring the 2nd level to perfection. I weighed my grinding speed, looked up, and told him that within 10 days it should be done. Guak Rimsan, who had sat bored through the whole hour, came wide awake at that. Peng Supo too looked at me in some shock, since his own guess had been a month at the least. That month was the record set by earlier disciples who fit the technique to an extreme, and I had halved it and more. Guak Rimsan could not help asking whether I was in earnest. Knowing the old record himself, I asked back whether it was too fast. In truth, had the choice been mine, I would have preferred to cultivate the Tongwan technique quietly all the way to the 5th level. But the way the Wanjin sword sect passed down its techniques left me no such choice. So did most schools, which had to answer for you and to weigh your character and loyalty before handing anything over. Only among loose cultivators did anyone toss you a manual to cultivate alone. Short of stalling my own progress, I had no way to hide it, and after a few days of watching I saw no need. Peng Supo was strict but no villain, and once I had become his apprentice, I was bound to his branch anyway. Guak Rimsan grinned, half sure his junior brother was showing off, and said the fastest before me had taken over a month. Peng Supo waved it off, saying that 10 days or a month, the results would tell in the end, an estimate being only an estimate. I asked whether I might learn other techniques, and rather than refuse outright he asked, curious which ones. I said sword techniques, movement techniques, and archery, that this disciple had dabbled a little in all of them, and Guak Rimsan laughed that I had certainly picked up a great deal along the way. As a loose cultivator one always chased a bit of everything, I said with a laugh, and hoped I had not made a fool of myself before the senior brother. Peng Supo said he had never gone deep into archery, but that I could search the scripture pavilion for it later. Since my Tongwan technique was coming along, he could teach me one set of sword techniques and one of movement techniques. He thought a moment, drew 2 secret manuals from the shelf, and set them on the table. Guak Rimsan glanced at one and asked, puzzled, whether the Starry Night sword was not a touch weak, that it had been a long while since he had seen a disciple practice it. Peng Supo answered that the Starry Night sword was not made for fierce combat but leaned toward defense. At my thin realm, the strongest sword was wasted if the cultivation could not carry it. Being able to guard my own life when danger came was the better choice, and Guak Rimsan, thinking of my raw bone forging standing, granted the sense of it. The soul-chasing step was the same, Peng Supo said with a smile, no good for nimble tricks or high leaps, but first-rate for a long pursuit. When danger came, he said, I was not to fix always on holding my ground. If I could run, I should run, and there was no shame at all in it. My eyes lit, the words landing exactly to my taste, since when I met a man I could not beat, of course I should run. I had only just been wishing for something good at fleeing, since every martial artist I ran into now stood at the marrow refining or organ refining realm and came from a school. Their strength ran far past the loose cultivators, so that thinking to fight across ranks was near hopeless. When I could not win, running fast was everything. I thanked him with cupped hands, and he opened the Starry Night Sword manual and said that few disciples practiced it these days. Beyond its want of offense, it was fiercely hard to learn, and I must listen close and ask whenever something escaped me. He began on the steps, and the Starry Night Sword did prove far harder than the swords I had practiced before. Its stance is almost all defensive with only a move or two that struck outward. I cast off every stray thought and gave myself over to it, asking the instant a point slipped past me. Another hour went by before he finished. He asked whether I had learned it. I glanced at the panel, the Starry Night Sword already at entry, but its bar longer than the techniques before it, 1 point of 300, and told him this disciple had. He nodded and glanced at Guak Rimsan, and seeing his interest did not send him off, taking up the other manual, the soul-chasing step. Another hour of it followed, Pung Supo breaking off here and there to walk through a few steps himself. The soul-chasing step proved no easier than the Starry Night Sword, harder if anything to my dim sense of it. I checked the panel and found the soul-chasing step also at entry, its required proficiency the same as the Starry Night Sword. That set me thinking that the panel asked the same of any technique of the same rank, and gave no weight to a soft thing like how hard it happened to feel. That was all for the day, he said, and since Guak Rimson knew little of either the Starry Night Sword or the soul-chasing step, I was to bring my questions to him. He handed me the 3 secret manuals, and I took them quickly and thanked him for passing on the arts. He watched my back as I left with a smile, for he had once thought my achievements in this life would come to only so much, and this was a welcome surprise. Beyond the reasons he had named, he had taught me the Starry Night Sword and the soul-chasing step to test my comprehension. If I merely fit the Tongwan technique to an extreme, my ceiling, while not low, would still cap somewhere near the organ refining realm, whereas true comprehension would lift that ceiling far higher. The organ refining realm was only the last of the 5-body refining realm alone. I told him I was ashamed to have eaten up so much of his day, meaning the senior brother. He laughed and asked why I should be so polite, when the chance to hear the master unfold the mysteries of a technique was one he would scramble for. No waste of time at all. This was no mere courtesy, since the principles of techniques ran together at times, and hearing more never hurt. He added of a sudden that the mission's day was fixed, 5 days off, and told me to prepare, since we would be several days in the mountains. I said I understood, and asked him to look after me when the time came. We talked a while longer and parted midway, and I went back to my quarters, shut the door and bent my whole mind on the panel. In a single day I had come by 3 cultivation techniques, all of them top tier, a haul I had not seen in a long while. Once I cultivated the 3 to perfection, my strength would climb another whole step. My first move was to fuse each of the 3 new techniques with what I already held. The system found each in turn. It asked whether I would spend 1,500 won to simplify the second level of the Tongwan technique. Another 1,000 won would simplify the Starry Night Sword, and 1,000 more would simplify the soul-chasing step. The Tongwan cost had gone up and neither sword nor step came cheap, but all of it sat inside what I could bear. Simplify, I answered. The second level of the Tongwan technique simplified down into the first level. The Starry Night Sword simplified into the Chawan Sword. The soul-chasing step simplified into the cloud-ascending walk. I drew a deep breath, since it was time to grind for experience yet again, and I set myself a small mark first, to cultivate the soul-chasing step to great perfection inside 5 days. The days went by one after another. I did alchemy in the morning and spent the afternoon grinding the proficiency of the Tongwan technique and the soul-chasing step. I never once stepped out my door, back to the ascetic round of a monk. Even when night fell, I did not slow my pace. Past a certain level, a martial artist can let cultivation stand in for sleep to a degree, never as easy as sleeping. But how was I to pass up the late hours when the late work was this meaningful? In the blink of an eye, the 5th day came, and I went up into the mountains with Guak Rimson and the rest. The team ran large but was mostly hired herb gatherers, who would do the real gathering when the time came. Our own charge was to oversee and to haul the herbs back once enough had piled up. Reaching the camp on the mountain, Guak Rimson spoke up loudly to the junior brothers below, saying there was generally no danger up here, but always the odd exception. Everyone was to stay sharp and move a little faster, he said, and we could be home in half a month at the outside. The mission had come down to our branch, and could not be refused, one of a kind that circled round once a year for every inner sect disciple to finish. The school handed out heavy punishment for anyone who slacked it on purpose. The crowd shouted their yes to senior brother Guak and scattered to their posts. Nogun came up to me of a sudden, smiling, saying it had been a long time. In truth, I had already spotted him, and only hung back, undecided whether to go over, having beaten the man half senseless not long before. Though the point had been to cure him of his jokes, I still carried a private grudge in it. I said I had been busy with cultivation and out little, watching his face carefully, and found no scars and a clean recovery. Taking my stare for knowledge of the ambush, he said darkly that it seemed I had heard. He only hoped he never learned who it was, or he would never let the man off, and the matter was far from over. He had in fact suspected me, teased in the day and beaten that same night, but the strength shown had left him no ground to stand on. I was only into the bone-forging realm, and rumored to come from some backwater, no possible match for that. A sharp tongue had earned him enemies enough, and he had soon shifted his suspicion onto others. The senior brother was right, I agreed, and after a moment we each went to our posts. The day wore down. With oversight and generous wages, the take of herbs ran heavy, and in this range, whether from rich soil or some other cause, the herbs grew back fast. However, the crowd around Sonon City swelled. It had not dented the supply for pills in the least. By evening, the herbs were roped onto carts and started down the mountain, and every face had eased. At this rate, the mission might close in 10 days or so with no more sleeping under open sky. I paced my own stretch, not only to watch the gatherers, but to cultivate the soul-chasing step. For all the late nights and the day and night drilling, the time had run short, and the soul-chasing step still sat a few hundred proficiency shy of great perfection. Even short of it, my speed had already gained a great deal, with room for another leap once it peaked. A few hundred points I could likely finish this very day. The second level of the Tongwan technique had passed the halfway mark, close to my 10-day guess. The Starry Night Sword, drilled so often alongside the soul-chasing step, had come on well and neared great perfection too. I wandered the mission ground, my shape flickering in and out, when a great commotion broke from off toward the school's camp on the mountain. I flashed back in a moment and found a man on the ground drenched in blood, Sadeha, who had been hauling herbs earlier. I asked what had happened, turning to Nagun, already there when I arrived. Someone had ambushed our transport team, he said low, and Senior Brother Sa had cut his way out to bring word. Senior Brother Guak had taken a few junior brothers and rushed off to save the rest. I looked up and saw that the marrow refining senior brothers were indeed gone, everyone present at the bone forging realm like me. Sadeha took some pills, steadied a little, and dropped into a deep sleep. Half an hour passed with everyone waiting on edge for Guak Rimsen to return. Word already sent back by carrier pigeon, so the school would likely dispatch experts of its own. The transport team had flown the Wanjin sword sect's mark plainly, and someone had struck anyway, plainly holding neither the sect nor us, its disciples, in any regard at all. A voice begging for its life cut in of a sudden. Everyone turned to see a martial artist dragging an herb gatherer by the throat at a run, and in a moment he reached the camp and flung the man hard to the ground. The pattern on his clothes and that unmistakable long spear told the whole crowd who he was at once, of the Jiang Hong sect. Nagun looked at the herb gatherer, found him familiar, and on a second look placed him as one from his own stretch, and demanded why the man had hurt his gatherer. Guang Zhengpa shouted that a trespasser on his school's ground he could have killed outright, and that the question ran the other way, whether we thought his Jiang Hong sect had no men. His long spear dropped into his hand, and his aura swallowed the whole scene. The Wanjin sword sect disciples traded looks. The Sonan sword sect had set many schools to this task, the Jiang Hong sect among them, and the gathering grounds had been marked out beforehand, though only roughly. Calling it a crossed boundary might hold in theory, yet the divisions were vague and the gatherers were no fools. Why would a man wander into another school's ground merely to earn a little more, all that trouble for nothing? Someone offered in a friendly tone that there might be some misunderstanding here. Guang Zhengpa sneered that it was a misunderstanding only because the man said so. He had watched the man cross the line and steal herbs with his own eyes, and that was only what he had seen. The gatherer, terrified, cried out that he had not, since a charge like that made good might see him beaten to death. Guang Zhengpa asked whether he had told the man to speak, and appeared before the gatherer in a blink and kicked him in the chest. The man spat blood and crashed into the table behind him. I caught the gatherer's body and dissolved the giant strength packed in the blow, the only thing that kept him alive. Even so, he bled from nose and mouth and would die shortly untreated. I frowned, tapped a few of his points with my energy, forced a healing pill into his mouth, and let my energy to draw the medicine through him, then set him down. It was all I could do, and whether he lived would rest on how stubborn his own life proved. Someone burst out at Guang Zhengpa for committing murder without so much as clearing the matter first. His words and his deed lit the Wanjin sword sect disciples' anger on the instant, a fire already banked in their chests over the strike at the transport team. His arrogant, overbearing march up to demand a reckoning was more than they could swallow. He asked whether they wanted a fight, no fear on him at all, but battle intent kindling in his eyes. Among martial artists, he said, when talk failed, a fight was the right road, the winner plainly in the right. On Jagyom stepped out, his eyes fixed on the man. With Guak Rimsen gone and the other marrow-refining senior brothers away, On Jagyom held the highest seniority there. Guang Zhengpa looked every inch a man hunting a fight with a reason cooked up to hand, and by rights they would strike back, save that they could not win. His realm sat solid in the marrow refining while they stood at the bone forging, so that thrashing them, more men or no, would cost him nothing. One realm higher was at times an immense edge, the more so for a schoolman whose techniques were all top-tier picks. He wanted nothing, Guang Zhengpa chuckled, only justice. Scanning the crowd, he proposed that each school send one man to fight a match, and to salt it that they wager a few cartloads of herbs. My eyebrow rose. So after all the talk, it was the herbs he was after. With several schools set to this task, a short haul meant more time wasted on the mountain. At dull work everyone wanted done and behind them. No wonder the Jiang Hong sect had fixed on the Wanjin sword sect, being the stronger of the two. On Jagyum said, his brows nodding deep, that a marrow-refining man was bullying us at the bone forging. He could suppress his realm, Guang Zhengpa threw back with a mocking glance. If that was not enough, he could fetch a junior brother of his own at the bone forging. Few as such men were in his school. A loud shout cut in, asking why Kwang Jungpa reached for a bone-forging man when the speaker would keep him company himself. Guak Rimsan's shape came on from far off and stood before the camp in a moment, and without another word a broadsword filled his hand and a slash flew at Kwang Jungpa. Kwang Jungpa laughed a greeting, his spear moving like a dragon churning the sea to strike the sword's tip, but his face changed at once as the spearhead bent under the force. A dull crack, and he was driven back despite himself. Guak Rimsan pressing the edge, his sword style unfurling to wrap Kwang Jungpa whole. They say a spearman is unmatched, and his wide-open style is made for the assault. Yet here it was Kwang Jungpa held down and battered. Guak Rimsan's sword ran the more unrestrained of the two, every strike and turn of it beating the temper clean out of him. Another crash sent Kwang Jungpa sliding back several steps before he checked himself, while Guak Rimsan gave a single step and wore a thin scratch on his cheek. Watching, the two ran even, and to force a winner they would have to spend everything, and at that point it might turn to the death, no end until one of them fell. Kwang Jungpa said, eyeing Guak Rimsan and half-cupping his hands, that he had both giant strength and iron bones. It seemed he would break through to the organ refining realm before long, and he offered his congratulations. Guak Rimsan waved the useless words away and told him to keep fighting if he wanted a fight, refusing the goodwill outright. They would leave it there for the day, Kwang Jungpa said after a beat, tossing out a polite parting about sparring next time, and with a flash of movement he was gone. The disciples came forward with glad faces that the senior brother had returned at last, since without him in time the thing here would have been hard to untangle. Guak Rimsan's voice dropped of a sudden. He had not made it in time, he said, and 2 junior brothers were dead. Little as he had spent with them, they were of the same school, and now they were simply gone, the lost herbs a mere trifle beside it. The smiling disciples froze. They had braced for it after a fashion, but hearing it plainly was hard to take. A task with no danger, only herbs to escort, right beside Sonan City, and 2 junior brothers dead on the first day, a loss none could stomach. On Jagium ground out through his teeth, asking whether he had seen who did it. By the traces, Guak Rimsan said low, it might well have been the Shinyeom sect. Someone burst out at the name of the Shinyeom sect, who were forever set against the Sonan sword sect, and asked why they would turn on us all at once, and the crowd churned. The name pulled my brows down. This was a school the country around Seonan City took for an evil sect, forever aimed at the Seonan sword sect, sworn and irreconcilable foes. They kept no fixed headquarters and were always slipping out of reach, yet every time they surfaced they made real trouble for the Seonan sword sect. The Seonan sword sect had tried more than once to stamp them out. Yet the Shinyeom sect rose again from the ash a while later, as though their people could never be cleared away for good. The Shinyeom sect had always been a law unto itself, Guak Rimsan said with a shake of his head. Perhaps in their eyes the Wanjin sword sect passed for a limb of the Sonan sword sect, so that cutting down a few of us meant nothing. Were they not wary of every school closing in to crush them together, they would likely leave no one any peace at all. A little later the last few marrow refining disciples came back bearing the remains of the 2 dead. Sitting beside Guak Rimsan in the camp, I asked whether the Janghung sect men might be the suspects. The convoy was struck, and then the Janghung sect turned up to make trouble so soon after. An easy line to draw. He did not know, he said. It might be them or might not. The Janghung sect liked to send men to squeeze an advantage out of every mission, seeing our Wonjin sword sect as easy to bully, and he smiled bitterly after. The Wanjin sword sect was not weak, but set against the other 3 schools it still fell short. The best talents around Seonan City were sifted first by the Seonan sword sect, and only then by the rest. The Janghung sect, which took only those under 13 and stood stronger than us, drew people ahead of us as well. After layer on layer of sorting, those who landed at the Wonjin sword sect, while not the dregs, ran a step behind the other schools in talent. Arrogant as Kwang Jungpa had been, he had not been wrong on one count. Among the Janghung sect disciples old enough and cleared to travel, a bone-forging man was the rarest of the rare. The Wanjin sword sect held no few bone-forging men among its inner-sect disciples, myself in that older youth crowd of which the sect had many. I turned the talk and asked whether he had brought the Tongwan technique to perfection, at the 5th level. He said with a soft laugh that he had, lucky enough to manage it these last few days. He had me to thank, since my maxing the 1st level so fast would have seen him overtaken had he been any slower. I had nothing to say to that, since he had gone and stirred himself up over me. After this mission he meant to ready his breakthrough to the organ refining realm, he said with a note of longing, and then he would have his chance to contend for the true disciple legacy. Every martial artist wanted to cultivate higher arts and lift his own realm, himself no exception. Some disciples cried out all at once that junior martial Uncle Jian was here. The rest of us stood quickly to find a middle-aged man in the camp, cast like a Confucian scholar yet carrying in his face a weight that commanded respect without any show of anger. Guak Rimson hurried up to greet Junior Marshal Uncle John Rimdo, who told him in a heavy voice to lay out everything that had happened start to finish, not a single detail left out. Guak Rimson reported the whole sequence, the signs he had read at the site of the attack, the Jiang Hong sect disciple Kwang Zhengpa coming to stir up trouble. All of it in full. When he had done, Jian Rimdo frowned, his face grave, and said to keep gathering the herbs, that he would escort the coming loads himself a few times. If the Shinyam sect had truly marked us, the disciples alone could not hold them, and a larger move would put the whole camp in danger. The odds of it ran a shade lower, since short of facing the Sonan sword sect, the Shinyam sect rarely dealt with other schools so hard. Guak Rimson nodded, and John Rimdo vanished from the camp, off to the other schools to learn whether only we had been hit or everyone stood in the same boat. Night came, and the gatherers returned. No more herbs to be had in the dark and danger in it besides. Bonfires were lit and the talk ran low, while I drilled my movement technique in a nearby wood, the long sword flashing in my hand without a pause. Guak Rimson sat watching my shape at its work in the distance, and could not help a nod, such labor shaming even him. He had heard before that I holed up in my room to cultivate and rarely came out for any amusement, and had taken the rumor for exaggeration. Seeing it now, he found the rumor had if anything undersold it. It was only my thin natural talent that was the pity of it. Truly unfair. Some men are gifted and need no toil to stand above others, while some may grind themselves hollow and change little in the end. There is no help for it, since the world is simply made that way. So some give up on themselves and drift their days out in a haze, while some refuse to bow and drive on all the same. They leave the outcome to heaven no matter how small the yield. At least his junior brother fit the Tongwan technique, he murmured, so the breakthrough to the organ refining realm should give no trouble. With comprehension that was not bad, there might be a way yet further on. Then he closed his eyes and set the Tongwan technique circling. Once it stood at perfection at the 5th level, the breakthrough to the organ refining realm came as a natural thing, without the least snag. As the night deepened, my shape still flickered, and in the next instant I dropped from where I stood and appeared on a far treetop. The panel called the soul-chasing step great perfection at last. A smile broke over me, since the movement technique had finally reached its peak. The soul-chasing step at great perfection did not let me down, my speed several times what it had been, living up to the very name. I looked at the long sword in my hand. Up on the treetop, sword light spread suddenly across my whole body, so that from a distance it looked as though countless shields ringed me round. I shifted my feet and flickered along the treetop. Any leaf or branch that neared me shredded at once, then a streak of sword light shot out of the shield of blades and sheared a treetop several yards off clean flat. The panel called the Starry Night Sword Great Perfection. A smile could not help blooming over me, but I did not rest, turning back toward camp instead to sit cross-legged and cultivate. I had not finished the day's internal chi work, and the 2nd level of the Tongwan technique still wanted grinding. There would be no rest, and the night was set to be a long one. Early the next morning, the gatherers took up their work again, and the disciples spread out to oversee them. Nothing came of the whole morning, and the wagons in camp already stood heaped with herbs. Fresh picked, they were best sent to Sionun City in time for processing. The Sionun sword sect looked down on other schools' pills and held its herbs to a strict standard, so the daily haul down the mountain could not be skipped. Everything was ready, Guak Rimson told John Rimdo. John Rimdo nodded and said for him to stay, that a few marrow refining disciples would go along instead. The day before, Jian Rimdo had asked the other schools and found not all had been struck, only the Bukdu Tower having met the same as us. Because of their technique, the Bukdu Tower men all ran to fiery impatient tempers that only a high realm could temper. So the Bukdu Tower had already set a grand hunt afoot for the culprits, bent on rooting them out. With a fuss like that raised, perhaps no one from the Shinyam sect would come that day. In less time than it takes to drink a cup of tea, the convoy was packed and away, Jian Rimdo dressed down as an ordinary disciple to follow it. The rest of the camp went on as before. An hour later, a carrier pigeon flew in, and Guak Rimson slipped the message from its leg. Several disciples crowded round asking after the situation, and he looked up and said the convoy had reached Sionun City safely, that Jian Rimdo and the others had met no attack. The disciples nodded, glad of it, their feelings tangled all the same. They hoped on one hand that no such strike would come again for the risk of lives, and on the other that the Shinyam sect would keep coming. With John Rimdo there, they might avenge the 2 disciples lost the day before. I stood nearby, and seeing Guak Rimson and the rest at ease, I knew nothing had gone wrong. 1 day, 2, 3, and in the blink of an eye 3 days had passed. The gathering ran in good order, and the convoy was not struck again, everything seeming to have slid back to normal. Jian Rimdo asked around the other schools and found no more attacks anywhere, as though the first day had been no more than a whim of the Shinyam sect. Yet the Shinyam sect did often move this way, many of its strikes falling without warning. At times, when the ground favored them and everyone braced for them to press the edge, they would suddenly pull back. At other times, with defeat plainly on them, they would turn like madmen and throw men to their deaths, for no sense anyone could find. Under the cover of night, cultivating cross-legged, I felt a chill run across my arm. I opened my eyes to it and found the bone-attaching curse gone active. I rose at once and looked about, but nothing showed and the mark stirring ran low. Only I knew too little of such specters to sit on it, and thought it better to report. I called low to senior brother Guac, and he opened his eyes and asked what it was, puzzled. There might be a specter close by, I said, and asked whether we should warn Junior Marshal Uncle Gian. He echoed the word, and stood, taken aback. I put out my arm and showed the faint black mark on it. He asked whether that was the cursed poison, placing it at last. A specter had marked me back then. I told him briefly, and I had later found the cursed poison keen to the aura of specters, and so had kept a little of it on me. I was lucky, he said, curious, that the specter had not come hunting me after. Thinking of Pyongyang County, I shook my head and said no, that the specter had a larger prize in view. He did not press it, seeing my face, and after a moment said that since the cursed poison was reacting, a specter really must be near, though it should not be strong. He said that for the camp's safety we should go and look, and pull back if it proved too much. He drew a red candle from the bag at his back and said that, with this we could hold a while even facing a specter. I told him I had one too, and took a red candle from my sleeve, at which he laughed that there was nothing to fear then. I set off tracking by the strength of the bone-attaching curse's reaction, which ran weak indeed, far below the specters I had met before. That very weakness was why I did not mind hunting it. We walked and halted as the specter seemed itself to move. Until before long we had covered close to 10 miles. Guac Rimson stopped and said there was no need to chase it further, since the specter was either passing through or under someone's control, and at this range could hardly threaten the camp. There was no call to kill off every specter so long as it left us alone. I nodded and was about to speak when I checked all at once, my ears twitching at faint, blurred voices drifting from far off. I looked to Guac Rimson, who had plainly caught them too. I asked whether that was the temporary camp of some school. He shook his head and said no, that side lay in shade where no herbs grew this season, so no school was stationed there. I said it might then be the Shinyem sect. His eyes lit on the moment, the odds of it high, though to be sure we would have to follow and confirm. He said in a heavy voice, his eyes on the distance, that his cultivation was too thin. He told me to go back first, find Junior Marshal Uncle Gian, and have him bring men over. He meant to look alone, and I could not help arguing that it was too dangerous. It was fine, he said with a smile. He would only watch from afar and keep out of harm's way. We needed to grasp the situation, or we would know nothing when John Rimdo and the others arrived, which would be more dangerous still. I opened my mouth, then nodded in the end, since it was the soundest course. I dared not dawdle and ran back fast along the way we had come. The sooner to call for help, the less the danger to Guac Rimson. My feet moved like the wind, and I had gone only a few miles when my face changed. The bone-attaching curse, quiet a moment before, flared active again, and there was another specter near. And the mark stirring climbed higher and higher. That specter was pouncing straight toward where I stood. The specters on this mountain had multiplied out of nowhere, and I cursed the luck of it as I ran. Either the slopes held none at all, or the things came popping out of the dark, two at a time. I had no wish to meet one face to face, not with their strange, unaccountable powers, and least of all now, when I could not afford to lose a single breath. I still had a message to carry back to the encampment, so I caught the direction the last one had lunged from, cut a short arc wide of it, and bent my legs back toward the sect's camp. After a mile or so, I felt the mark on my arm again, and its stirring had gone quiet. The specter was falling away behind me, or more likely it simply could not keep my pace. I let out a thin breath of relief. Set against the chaos of those abilities, I would admit the creatures unsettled me, and I knew the reason well enough. My own realm sat too low. Had my chi and blood burned like a proper furnace, no common specter could have come within arm's reach of me. I read the lay of the slopes and judged I had covered half the ground, with a couple of miles yet between me and the tents. Then a voice slid out of the dark low and honeyed, asking the young master why he ran so hard when the night was so long. A figure rose on a hillside ahead of me and stood square across my path. I checked myself hard, and yet the mark on my arm had not so much as twitched, which told me the thing in front of me was no specter. On that thought, I dropped my head, and when I lifted it again, my face had already shifted into something that passed for Seo Mangriang of Humbun City. She called me young master and said she was in some pain and asked whether I might come and take a look for her. As she spoke, her robe slipped from one shoulder bearing skin as white as fresh snow. Threads of whispering wound into my ears, and a swell of raw wanting rose up in me. My eyes clouded over, and I began to walk toward her one heavy step at a time, as though my will had drained clean out. She thanked the young master in advance for his kindness, saying he was nothing like the others who would not lift a finger to help a poor servant. Then she gave a small bow, and a coaxing smile bloomed on her face. In my eyes just then, it was the loveliest smile in all the world, the kind a man would cross a mountain of blades and a sea of fire to earn. The Chongxin technique flared of its own accord, and my mind snapped clear in an instant. The whispering still coiled at my ears, but with the technique braced against it, I did not slide under a second time. A chill of sweat rose along my back, and not only because I had been charmed. My disguised face had very nearly slipped back to its true shape, and had I woken a breath later, it would have unraveled completely. That would have been the end of me right there. I did not let my stride or my face change by a hair. I kept my gaze dull and straight ahead, and I even held the frequency of my shifting features exactly as it had been. A moment on, my face flowed into another borrowed shape, one that carried a passing likeness to Quang Zhongpa of the Zhang Hong sect. She laughed softly and asked why a man with so handsome a face had bothered to wear an old man's earlier. Her chest rose and fell with the laugh, and I let a look of greedy fervor spread over my own face, and even quickened my pace toward her. In another breath I stood before her. She raised the tip of her right index finger, and the nail on it caught a sharp piercing glint of light. Leaning in, she asked why I wandered outside so late, and whether I had come across something. As she leaned, I let my eyes drop to a bottomless hollow and let my breath grow heavier. If nothing else, I thought, on the strength of that alone, the hunger I was miming had to look convincing. I stammered that a few of the senior brothers had sensed a specter and gone out to look, and that, a look of struggle twisted my face, as if I fought to tear free of her spell. She told the young master not to fret, to speak slowly, that she was listening, her eyes bored into mine, dark as a well, and one could not help but feel oneself sinking. There was a junior brother, too, I choked out, who had gone off toward. Veins stood up on my forehead, and I lifted my left hand in a shaking point, as though to mark a place. She asked me where he was, her body tipping forward without her meaning it to, the ink in her eyes going deeper still. I told her he was here. The Chengxin technique surged all at once and broke her charm by force, and she could not hold back a low, muffled groan. In my eyes, the whole world slowed to a crawl. Her head tilted back, her hair sweeping the air, and yet her right hand had already swung out on its own to crush my throat. I gathered every scrap of strength in my body, drove it up from my toes, and thrust my right hand forward in the fifth form of the sword. She snapped that I was out of my place. Dizzy and robbed of the first move, she still drew her left hand in to shield her heart. She had seen that my hand held no weapon, that I fought with 2 fingers for a blade, and the color of my skin told her I had cultivated no hardening art. She was sure her palm would take a scratch at worst, that she could flip her hand and snap my fingers off where they stood. I caught the scorn in her eyes plainly, and just as my sword fingers were about to touch her palm, a dagger slid into my grip out of nowhere. It was done in the space of a blink. The dagger punched clean through her palm and drove its tip into her chest. At the last instant, she shifted her body a fraction, so the point missed her heart, and the blow only bruised the muscle over it. She screamed like something gone mad, and before I could so much as twist the blade, her right hand came sweeping at my head. My starry night sword shield rose and caught it, but the force behind it was more than I could hold, and it flung me backward off my feet. She shrieked that I had dared to wound her, that she would kill me. She looked down at her chest, already a slick red ruin, a hair's breadth from death, a proud expert of the organ-refining realm, all but slain by a mere bone-forging man. A moment before she had felt the whole game sitting in her palm. That seduction was hers by her own hand, potent enough to bind a man at the bone-forging, or even the marrow-refining realm, and a weak-willed organ-refining cultivator besides. Now she had swallowed a heavy loss to a scrap of a bone-forging fighter, and I could see plainly there was no swallowing it. I told her she was hurt, that she should rest well and mend, and I wished her goodbye. I looked at the crazed thing her face had become and wondered where all that grace and allure had gone. I gave her a smile, flickered into motion, and shot off toward the sex camp. She spat that I meant to run. Behind me, she swallowed a pill, pressed medicine to her chest, and reined the wound in with her inner strength, barely dragging her body back to stable. By every law, she needed to stop and heal, for even her heart had been rattled by that blow. But to let me come and go as I pleased was more than she could stomach. If she did not kill me this night, she would never live the shame down. So the demoness came on. I threw the soul-chasing step open to its full width, and the trees on either hand blurred into streaks, and still she clung close at my heels. This was my first true brush with an organ-refining expert, and it opened my eyes wide. Even carved up as she was, her footwork stayed this fast. Put another way, had I not cut her open first, I would not have shaken her no matter how I tried. And it was not the footwork alone. Without the great perfection Starry Night Sword shield, her counter would have laid me open just now, and one exchange had already left my long blade nicked and strained. A few more clashes like that and the sword would shatter outright. Barehanded against her, I would be flattened in a handful of moves. There it was, the raw gulf between the bone-forging realm and the organ-refining realm laid out for me to feel. The ladder of martial realms climbs one true rung at a time, and no man fakes a step of it. Hidden darts came whistling in from behind, my long sword woven to a blur, as if a wall of small shields ringed me round. Where the darts struck, they only let me force to fling myself faster ahead, none of them touching me at all. That was the marriage of the Great Perfection Starry Night Sword shield and the Great Perfection soul-chasing step. Every ounce of force I spent answered as though it were an arm grown out of my own body. Behind me she was grinding her teeth, and I could all but hear it. A worthless bone-forging man had handed her one surprise after another this night. I had shrugged off her charm, conjured a dagger that made a joke of her guard, and run footwork no slower than a fair organ-refining expert's. She prided herself on her own speed, and even wounded she outpaced any cultivator of her rank, yet she could not close on me. She cried out asking whether I truly thought I could slip away like this. She dragged in a few deep breaths, then coughed up a mouthful of blood, and inside that red mist her speed leapt, having in a stroke the dozens of yards she had lain behind me. In the next breath it seemed, she would have me. Feeling that crushing weight bear down at my back, I threw everything into a raw burst of speed, my force and chi wheeling through me, my whole body turning light as a leaf. The next instant I had torn far out ahead again. Claw marks scored the ground where I had stood a heartbeat before. She had to be asking herself how a man whose cultivation ran so thin had come by so many arts, and cursing that I had not simply poured it all into my realm instead. Had I stood at the marrow refining realm, she would never have grown careless, and it was only my low realm that had let her guard slip, and here we were. She watched my back draw further and further off, and rage took her, and she brought up another mouthful of blood, her face going the gray of ash. She was gravely hurt already, and she had spent a secret technique on top of it, and now the wounds stacked one upon the other. I lifted my voice and called out that Uncle Jian should help, that a demonic woman was trying to kill me. The cry carried far, and it snuffed out whatever will she had left to chase. Hurt as she was now, one same-rank cultivator crossing her road would mean her death. She fixed her glare on me and burned my face into her memory, swearing this was not the end, that she would repay the grudge twice over. Then her figure blurred and was gone from the spot. I shouted a few more times, felt the presence behind me wink out, and let my shoulders drop. Being run down by an organ refining expert is a foul feeling. I had ambushed her, I had opened her up, and I still could not beat her, which sat sour in my chest. Worse, I had no notion what secret techniques such an expert might keep in reserve. I feared she might throw caution to the wind and hunt me with nothing left to lose, and against that I truly might not have gotten clear. So I had cried for help from a good way off, and it had frightened her off after all. Cheap trick. Worked, though. After another mile, before the camp came into view, I found Uncle Jian already rushing my way, having caught my shout from far off. The senses of an organ-refining cultivator, and a top-tier one at that, were a fearsome thing to witness. He asked whether the shouting had been me, and his brows drew down. I told him it was, panting, and said that senior brother Guac and I had felt something strange lurking about and gone out to look. We had found a band of people camped some 10 miles off, I said, and suspected they were of the Shineum sect. His eyes flew wide at the name. Nothing was certain yet, I said, and laid out the lay of the ground over there, a shaded hollow, well away from where we had been cutting herbs, which was what raised our suspicion. Senior brother Guac had stayed behind to keep eyes on them, I told him, and sent me back to bring word at once. He thought a moment, then said he would take me along so I could show him the way. First he ducked back to camp to give the other disciples their orders. Then he gripped my arm and rushed forward, dropping small marks along the trail so the men behind could follow. On the way I told Uncle Jian that I had run into a demonic woman as well, one who could charm men, her cultivation surely at the organ refining realm. I gave him the short of what had happened. Seok Solgium was hurt and would be no match for Uncle John, but I could not be sure the other side kept only the one organ refining expert, so I wanted him wary. He said he had caught the words demonic woman on the wind earlier, which was why he had come out alone to lend a hand. She had seemed injured, I said, and I had been lucky to slip free. I said nothing about having wounded her badly myself, mostly because no one would credit it. 2 whole realms sat between the bone forging and the organ refining, and by any reckoning I ought to have been pinched dead like a chick. A bone forging man trading blows across that gulf sounded like nonsense on its face. Better to leave it be and simply say the woman had come away hurt somehow. He nodded. If that hollow truly held a Shineum sect camp, and if experts walked among them, it was ordinary enough. He only hoped senior brother Guac Rimson would keep his head and not blunder into danger. 10 miles was no great stretch, and with Uncle Jian sprinting at full stride we crossed it in no time. Guac Rimsan was nowhere to be seen. Instead, the far camp had fallen into chaos, the clash of fighting rising in ragged waves, loud and disordered. He set me down and told me to wait there and join up with the others. Then he charged straight in. Plainly in his eyes, my bone-forging cultivation ran too thin to be of use, and I would only be one more body to shield. I stood there a moment, turned it over, and followed anyway. In a close press, hemmed by my realm, I could lord it over men of my own rank and no higher, and against a marrow-refining fighter I would need a sneak strike to win. But the soul-chasing step let me come and go as I liked. Knowing senior brother Guak Rimsan was in danger, how was I to stand there wooden and indifferent? Feeling someone at his back, Uncle John turned and asked whether he had not told me to rendezvous with the rest, his brows nodding the instant he saw it was me. My footwork was not bad, I said in a low voice, and perhaps I could help. Before he could get a word out, I stepped past him in a single flash and left him behind. Whatever he had meant to say stuck in his throat. From the footwork I had just shown him, even should the fight turn to mayhem, I could keep myself whole, and I might even pull senior brother Guak Rimson out of it. We drew up at the rim of the battlefield. Looking out across it, I made out a cave in the distance, most likely where the Shinyom sect had kept themselves hidden. Uncle Jian named the newcomers as men of the Bukdu Tower, and he seemed taken aback, not having thought the Bukdu Tower would reach this place ahead of us. I scanned the whole scene and spotted senior brother Guak Rimson at once, a broadsword in his fists, hewing at the Shinyom sect fighters, several of their corpses already sprawled behind him. Uncle Jian read the field and said it would be over soon, that there were no real experts among the Shinyom sect here, and he stooped into a dive like an eagle folding its wings. I gripped my long sword and threw myself into the melee as well. The Bukdu Tower men marked outsiders wading in and stiffened, then eased when they caught Uncle John's face, for they had crossed paths several times these past days and counted as old acquaintances. I reached senior brother Guak Rimson's side, the starry night sword shield spinning around us, batting away the weapons aimed at him one after another. He said I had come back, and a smile broke across his face, then froze there because he had seen the sword art I was using. The starry night sword. He blinked, plainly baffled. If memory served him, our master had only handed me that art a few days back. 10 days at the very most. He could not quite pin it down, 10 days or fewer, but he was certain the span had been short. So short he half wondered whether his eyes had gone bad. Or perhaps the fighting had run so hard that he was seeing things, imagining I had ground the starry night sword to its peak in a handful of days. I called for him to watch himself and turned aside a blow meant for his back. He gave a roar and sprang like a tiger, closing on a Shinyom sect man and sending him flying with one stroke. That fellow coughed blood in midair, and by the time he struck the earth there was scarcely any life left in him. I sighed to myself. He was impressive. Having driven the Tongwan technique to its full 5th level, with the giant strength and iron bones traits stacked on top, senior brother Guak Rimson carried a power far past other fighters of his rank. Were I to take a stroke of his head on, even behind the starry night sword shield, I could not have parried it. I would have had to give ground and let the force bleed off, just as against Seok Solgim. That did not make him her better mind. They simply excelled at different things, and to stand against an expert of her caliber he would need to break into the organ refining realm first. With Uncle John added to the scale, the Shinyom sect's resistance came apart fast, and in a moment the fighting was spent. The man heading the Bukdu Tower stepped up and hailed Uncle John, thanking the Wanjin sword sect for the great aid. The two spoke a while, then set to combing the ground for whatever traces the Shinyom sect had left. But as ever with the Shinyom sect, the captured died of poison on the spot, no one able to say where the poison had been hidden. Dislocating their jaws no help at all. The scene gave up nothing. They had scoured it clean. The Wanjin sword sect disciples arrived late to it, and the sight on the field left every one of them plainly startled. Half an hour later, we sat inside the Wanjin sword sect encampment. Guak Rimsan turned the night over aloud. He had watched from across the way and meant to chance a closer look. Only the Shinyom sect seemed to catch some word, and began pulling straight back. Just as half of them had drawn off, the Bukdu Tower men appeared. The two sides fell to fighting, and he had gone in to help. And then he had seen Uncle Jian. Uncle Jian said in a heavy voice that it must have been that enchantress, gone back to carry the report. Guak Rimsan looked lost at the word enchantress. I put in from the side that I had met one on my way back, that she had been hurt, and that I had managed to escape. Understanding dawned on his face with a nod. Uncle Jian waved a hand and said everyone was worn out and should rest, that he had already sent word of all this back to the sect, and that reinforcements ought to follow before long. So many Shinyom sect men lay dead that some answer would surely come, so of course he had to ask the sect for more hands, where every man present stood in danger. The disciples scattered off, and Guak Rimson drew me aside into a corner. When I asked what it was, he leaned in and murmured whether I had ground the starry night sword all the way to perfection. No indeed, I said, shaking my head. Senior brother had surely misread it, for how could a sword art ripen that fast? He He rolled his eyes at me. He had watched it with his own 2 eyes, and here I stood denying it flat. I told him I had brought only a few forms of the Starry Night Sword to perfection, not the whole of it. I gave my longsword an idle sweep, and a scatter of sword shields winked into being around me. Unlike great perfection, where the shields sheath a man head to foot, these few showed only at a handful of points. He blinked. At the time he had stolen only a glance or two, so he could not be sure, and a few forms brought to perfection was a thing he could understand. Understand my foot I could read on his face. It was still monstrously fast, only not quite so absurd as before. I asked whether he knew the person and handed him a likeness of Seoksolgyam drawn from memory. He looked it over and said, with the flat honesty of a man who noticed such things last, that she was rather pretty, and asked who she was. The enchantress who had hunted me, I said. Then perhaps she had worn a disguise technique, he offered, frowning. She almost certainly had not, I said. When he asked how I knew, he looked up and near enough stepped back, for my face by then had taken a cast so like his own we might have been brothers. Because I know the disguise technique myself, I told him with a smile, so I can tell. Then I wiped a hand down my face and gave myself back my own. He gaped and said I actually knew the disguise technique, and that I must have drawn the likeness myself. Setting aside sword arts and footwork, so far as he knew I could shoot a bow and brew pills besides. I had won my way into the Alchemist Alliance on alchemy alone, a thing many a lifelong alchemist never managed. Now the disguise technique on top of it too much rounded into one man. Small wonder he felt a bit of a failure beside me. I said I was a loose cultivator after all, and a man like that needed a few tricks up his sleeve, or you would blunder into ruin all too easily. He looked as though he wanted to roll his eyes and ask whether I had some misunderstanding about what a loose cultivator was. If every loose cultivator ran this versatile, I could see the thought behind his face, then what were sect disciples like him even for? Was the world outside truly so hard now that a man had to learn this much to survive it? More skills never weighed a man down, I said, and laughed it off. He asked whether the demoness had seen my true face. He turned the lifelike likeness over in his hand, and I caught the shape of his envy plain enough. With drawing like that, he seemed to be thinking, if he ever wanted to see what a man looked like, he could just sketch it out himself. The moment I saw someone barring my path, I told him with a shake of the head. The first thing I did was change my face. Cautious enough, he said, praising me, then asked whose face I had put on. I said I had turned into him, and wiped my hand from brow to chin, and my features flowed into the likeness of Kwang Jongpa. Not a perfect match, since this was only muscle worked by hand and hard to make flawless, but the resemblance held. A fine change, he said, laughing outright, for he knew Kwang Jongpa at a glance, and the thought that the Shinyom sect might now set their sights on Kwang Jongpa lifted his mood considerably. I told him to keep the likeness on him, and to tell me if any word turned up. He nodded and said he would ask around quietly. If the thread led back and let them root out the Shinyom sect, then whether the sect guarded against them itself, or passed the word up to the Sionon sword sect, either road would serve. The night ran out fast. Early the next morning a good many of the Wanjin sword sect arrived, Peng Supo among them. Wak Rimsan and the rest bowed low the moment they saw him. He told them he already knew the whole of it, that they had all done very well. With a glance across his disciples, he said in a heavy voice that to head off any Shinyom sect reprisal, they would hold this ground several days more. Smiles could not help spreading. This way there was truly no more need to fret over the Shinyom sect, and their safety was assured. The herb gathering went on as before. The disciples kept to watching over it. The escort of the caravan and the guarding of the camp fell to Peng Supo and his fellows, to head off any desperate move by the Shinyom sect. A day slid by and night came down. With nothing else to occupy him, Peng Supo took to testing his disciples one by one, and came at last to me, Guak Rimsan there too. Guak Rimsan told our master he had ground the Tongwan technique to the 5th level of perfection, and would be fit to try the breakthrough to the organ refining realm in a few days. Peng Supo's eyes brightened. At Guak Rimsan's age, a 5th level Tongwan technique and a coming breakthrough put a true disciple legacy within reach, and should he win it, his branch would at last stand on the map. A master hopes always that his disciples will make their mark, and a true disciple counted as making one, worth every year Peng Supo had poured into the teaching. He told Guak Rimsan not to rush the crossing once he went back to try it, that with a 5th level Tongwan technique the breakthrough should come of itself. Guak Rimsan bowed his head and said he understood. Then Peng Supo turned to me with a smile and asked after my own cultivation. The Starry Night Sword and the soul-chasing step both ran fiendishly hard to grasp. He said so if I had any doubts of late, I could raise them now. He added that although the 2nd level of the Tongwan technique sat well with me, a few key points still wanted my care. Before I could answer, Guak Rimsan cut in from the side, smiling, saying he could not speak to the soul-chasing step, but that his junior brother had done wonders with the Starry Night Sword. Oh, Peng Supo asked, his curiosity pricked. In what way? Guak Rim-san winked at me and told me to show our master, quickly. I shook my head with a laugh, took up my long sword and stepped out into the open ground. I asked Peng Supo for his guidance, and he nodded me on. I pointed the blade obliquely at the earth, and the next instant the sword itself vanished as a ring of small shields sprang up and circled me, closing me safe within their turning. I showed only the perfection grade Starry Night sword shield and kept the great perfection hidden away. Peng Supo's eyes widened a touch, and he came near to thinking he had misseen it. His reaction ran much as Guak Rimsen's had the first time, though he had the greater composure of the two, and however startled he was within, his face barely moved. After a moment I drew to a halt and looked to him. Quite good, he said, allowing that some of the forms still moved a shade stiffly, but that more practice would master them, and he nodded, playing it calm. Guak Rimsen had been watching our master out of the corner of his eye, finding him steady from first to last. He could not help but feel Peng Supo well deserved the name of master, a man of true depth and long experience. I cupped my hands and said I understood. Enough of the Starry Night sword, Peng Supo said with a smile. And how went the soul-chasing step? Guak Rimsan looked at our master in some surprise, for the warmth in his manner was a thing he had not seen in a long while. I told him I had gleaned a little into the soul-chasing step as well, and on the words my figure flickered, carried me a dozen yards off, and flickered me back on the instant. The corner of Peng Supo's mouth gave a twitch, as though he were about to lose his grip on himself. Guak Rimsan's eyes went round. Why did his junior brother's footwork feel faster than his own, and was I not only at the bone-forging realm? Could the soul-chasing step run this fast? And had I already carried it to the very top? There were still stretches of it I had not grasped, I said with a smile. What I had shown ran only at the perfection grade, and I had tucked a share of my cards out of sight, not from any want of trust, only my own nature. Beyond a wish not to look too dazzling, I had no plan to take up fresh sword arts or footwork anytime soon. My cultivation ran too thin. Down here in the bone-forging realm, even with the Starry Night sword and the soul-chasing step in hand, I could feel that I still could not wring the fullest power out of either. The hardware was too poor, and a share of each art's deeper mystery stayed shut to me. I would need to reach the marrow refining realm at the least before the two could truly open up. Since that was so, there was no sense chasing new arts. Better to spend the hours on other things, my inner strength say, or my archery. Peng Supo's face was one broad smile, and had he not worn it, I think he would have laughed aloud. My comprehension, it was plain now, ran no way short of the true disciples, and even edged faintly past them. Once I ground the Tongwan technique to the 5th level, even a poor foundation would carry me to the organ refining realm in time. On comprehension alone, my odds of contesting a true disciple legacy might run higher than Guak Rimsen's. 2 possible true disciples among the students he taught. How was a master to keep from being glad of it? Even so, he told me not to grow smug, that my inner strength above all wanted catching up, and he charged me to keep the matter of my quick comprehension quiet for now, since my cultivation still ran too low. A genius draws envy, and mine sat too thin to fend off a strike from the dark. Better to hide and grow first, waiting for the day the young eagle finally spread its wings. I nodded and said I understood. Then he asked how the Tongwan technique itself was coming, more anxious over my inner strength art than over anything else. Guak Rimsen turned to look too, remembering the 10 days I had named the last time. That figure had sounded absurd then. Now the pair of them were half looking forward to it. Still a touch short, I said in a low voice, but it should be finished by tomorrow. I had braced for it, and still Guak Rimsen's eyes went wide, the corners of them fit to split. My showing simply too much to take. Where, he had to be wondering, had all his own years of grinding gone? Peng Supo was shaken too, for the talent I bared on the Tongwan technique was more frightful by far than the sword and footwork of a moment ago. He told me heavily to come find him the next night, when he would teach me the 3rd level of the Tongwan technique, and to rest now that the hour was late. We cupped our hands, answered yes, and watched him go. Guak Rimsan rubbed his eyes and resolved to cultivate the harder. Otherwise, in a few years, my cultivation might sail past his. And then how was he to go on being the senior brother? The whole of the 2nd day the mountain lay calm and still, and the transport train came back without a single ambush. The past days felt like something dreamed, as though the Shinyeom sect had forgotten us entirely. Yet the Wanjiam sword sect dared not slacken. The Shinyeom sect had stood toe-to-toe with the Seonin sword sect for years. A hard and troublesome foe, and a wilder reprisal might still be gathering. I went about my daily rounds, and toward evening I sought Peng Supo out. The first 2 levels of the Tongwan technique leaned toward the foundation. He told me, tedious to build but a thing a man can simply grind through. From the 3rd level on, because the giant strength trait awakens, the difficulty climbs a full rung. He laid the knacks of the Tongwan technique before me in fine detail, and even told a few of the tales behind the art. He let me know the straits it had been forged under, so I might understand it the better. A full 2 hours passed before he had finished teaching the third level. He asked whether I had it all. I glanced at the system panel, smiled and nodded. It logged the Tongwan technique at its third level, 1 step out of 6,000. If anything gave me trouble, he said with a smile I could seek him out at any hour these next few days. I thanked him, hands cupped. He added that I should mind my rest, for haste spoiled the work. Over the last 2 days he had watched how I cultivated, and truly diligent it was. Were every disciple under his wing this hard-working he seemed to feel, even the dull or talented among them might lift their achievements a whole grade. Such men, sadly, were ever the few. I said I understood, and took my leave. No sooner had I settled at my usual spot than Guak Rimsen came and sat down beside me. He asked with a smile whether our master had taught me the third level of the Tongwan technique. He had, I said, and I was grateful for the favor, the gratitude real in my chest. From the day I entered as a disciple until now, Peng Supo had never done me ill. He had held back no art, and answered every question I brought him with his whole heart. To have met a master like that, I truly counted myself lucky. At my words, a trace of a smile touched Guak Rimsen, and something wistful moved in his eyes. Had our master not run afoul of that old misfortune, I could see him thinking how much brighter a figure he would cut today. I looked over at him, curious, not knowing what he meant to say. He turned the talk aside and asked whether I knew that grinding the 5 levels of the Tongwan technique to perfection let a man break into the organ refining realm with ease. I did, I said, having heard several senior brothers speak of it. The art was just as its name ran, for at perfection the inner strength floods the whole body and the organ refining realm follows as night follows day. The Wanjin sword sect had planted its feet in Sonun City on the strength of it, which was why so many were glad to join. Then he lowered his voice and told me that, in truth, so long as I carried the Tongwan technique to the 4th level, I could sharply cut the time to reach the marrow refining realm. My eyes lit before I could stop them. There was such a boon in it. I had always taken the Tongwan technique to do no more than ease the barrier at a breakthrough. By my own reckoning, crossing into the marrow refining realm would cost me a year at least of banking inner strength, and grinding the art to perfection would shave off only a little. No slow pace, that, given how little time I had been at it. Yet in a world this cruel, I could not help craving a faster climb, for the security of it. Reading my face, Guak Rimsen could not help a smile, and said few disciples knew of this. Those able to grind the Tongwan technique to the 4th level already stood in the marrow refining realm, and I alone was the odd one out. I could not help smiling. If I bent every hour now to grinding the Tongwan technique's proficiency, I could hit the peak of the 3rd level in about 20 days. No faster than that, unless I got hold of pills to shield the meridians. I had never heard of such medicine before, I mused. But Sinon City might well be another matter. That cracked a whole line of thought open. I could plainly go round the medicine shops and ask, and failing that, the Alchemist Alliance ought to keep pills of the sort, or the formulas for them. I had simply never turned my mind to it. My hours crushed flat under the cultivating of one art after another. The night ran out with nothing amiss. I simplified the 3rd level of the Tongwan technique and set to grinding it in earnest. The whole of the next day the surroundings stayed quiet, the Shiny M sect seemingly gone for good. Still the Wanjin sword sect men in camp did not ease off, holding to the old arrangement, escorting the caravan and warding the tents. Time slipped past. 1 day, 2, 3, and the store of gathered herbs quietly crossed the halfway mark. Wary as everyone stayed, their hearts could not help loosening a little, though not one needful step was skipped. Even Master Peng Supo and a few others went out several times to scout for any sign of the Shiny Om sect, and in the end, turned up nothing. At nightfall I sat cross-legged, bent on turning my cultivation technique through its circuit. The force rolled fast through the whole of my body, shaking my bones and my muscles, wisps of heat rising off me until, from any distance, the air seemed to warp. Half an hour on, I breathed out a gust of stale chi and opened my eyes. My meridians had swollen tight. I would have to ease off a while before I pressed on, or I risked wounding myself. I stood and looked over the camp. Most sat cross-legged, cultivating in place of sleep so that they might rouse to any trouble on the instant. I only wanted a few steps to loosen my legs when a figure sprang up, and I turned in surprise to find it was my master, Peng Supo. A humming came off the long sword in his hand, faint to start, then in a breath grown deafening. At the sound, everyone woke and looked to him in confusion. There was trouble, he said, his voice grim, and everyone was to stand on alert. He cast his gaze off into the dark, brows drawn tight, the green longsword in his grip trembling on, as if it had caught the scent of something. Guak Rimsen appeared at my side and asked whether my bone-attaching curse showed any stir. A specter? I was half surprised and about to shake my head when a chill crawled up my arm. I drew my sleeve back and found the bone-attaching curse waking. He read the answer off my face at once. I asked him, startled, how he had known, since only days before it had been I who warned him, and tonight, he had it before I did. It was the Bio-Cryong sword in our master's hand, he murmured, his face grave. For when it met a specter, it sensed the thing on its own. Not every specter would trip the Bio-Cryong sword's warning, he said, but any that did was a very powerful one. Feeling the Bio-Cryong sword's shudder climb without pause, Uncle John's face changed, and with a roar he flashed to the front of the whole gathering, his eyes fixed hard ahead. He and the others reached Pung Supo's side and said in low, heavy voices that the trouble lay where the Bukdu Tower was camped. Pung Supo drew a deep breath and said this specter came for our handful of sects on purpose, and the Bukdu Tower had taken the first blow in our stead. He told them they would stay behind to cover the retreat and buy the disciples a little time. Uncle Jian and the rest nodded. Against a specter of this grade, ordinary disciples and herb gatherers who lingered would die in numbers too high to bear. Those at the marrow refining realm might fare a shade better and lend some small help, but only a shade, and only small. Those below it likely could not so much as scratch the thing. The herb gatherers fled headlong down the slope. Pung Supo had ordered the disciples to take them out. Yet the herb gatherers knew in their bones that when real, unstoppable danger came, the Wanjin sword sect disciples would not stand and die for them, and would break first. That the sect had not simply cast them off at the earliest chance was already counted decent of it. If it truly came to danger, I told Guac Rimson under my breath, he need not mind me, for I ran quick. He gave a grunt and a nod, though whether the words had gone in I could not say. We had run less than a quarter hour when a shriek tore up from behind. It seemed to want to lance clean through the ears, and even miles off it left a man dizzy and swollen in the skull. No one needed urging then. The herb gatherers ran the faster for it, many flinging their tools away outright to shed the weight. I glanced back, and a smear of blood red had spread across the distant sky, a red so bewitching that the mere sight of it clenched something tight in the chest. The Bio-Cryong sword was a spirit sword, Guac Rimson said with certainty, and our master would come to no harm. I was about to ask what a spirit sword was when the mark on my arm flared into a wild, seething life. My face changed. I swept my eyes around and off to the right met a pair of scarlet eyes. A wave of dizziness welled up, and the Chengsim technique smothered it on the instant. Knowing there were specters about, I had kept the Chengsim technique turning at every moment, for a heartbeat's delay would have cost me my life. I cried for Guac Rimson to watch out. That black shape had risen without a sound behind an herb gatherer, its mouth gaping wide, and it swallowed the man down in a single bite, too fast for either of us to stop. Only then did I see the thing clearly. Its whole body was green-skinned, layer on stacked layer, its frame hunched. A single eye sat so vast it looked ready to tumble from the socket, its belly so bloated it seemed to sag to the ground. Guac Rimson roared and flashed before the green specter, hacking down. The green specter only regarded him without expression, and his stroke faltered a hair, and in that gap the thing's mouth split wide and hurled the just-swallowed herb gatherer straight at him. There was a ring like fine iron on iron as the herb gatherer's claws slapped against Guac Rimson's broadsword, missing his face by a hair. In that sliver of time the herb gatherer had already turned specter himself, a puppet under the green specter's hand. Guac Rimson bellowed for it to get off him, his arms swelling out, and with one level sweep he flung the herb-gathering specter aside. Then he stepped in on the green specter and struck with the force of a mountain cleaving. A greenish arm spun up into the air. Before any joy could touch his face, the green specter's severed shoulder knit itself whole in a blink, and a fresh arm sprouted where the old had flown. I threw a sword shield up before him, and it caught the green specter's blow. Then I seized his shoulder and rushed us down the mountain. Neither of us yet knew that no fewer than 5 green specters had already gathered close around the two of us. We could not hold them. Guac Rimson saw the ring of horrors closing on us too, and could not help a sharp breath. He had taken that first green specter for a stray, and now they were leaking out of the dark in droves. He turned his head and told me to put him down, or it would drag on my footwork. It was fine, I told him with a smile. A carried man did not cost the soul-chasing step much, a tenth of my speed at most by my guess. He started to say his own footwork ran no slouch either. Then, feeling how fast the road on both sides was falling away, he shut his mouth. Mine outstripped his by a wide margin, a match without trouble for any common organ-refining fighter. Could the soul-chasing step truly be this useful? The thought had to be rising in him. Yet other senior brothers in the sect cultivated the soul-chasing step, and none of them ran anything near this. The 5 green specters fell far behind. Troublesome as they were, their speed sat at roughly a common marrow-refining fighter's. Then screams broke out at our backs, cries for help, someone shouting that specters were on them, a whole ragged chorus of terror. The 5 could not catch me, but catching herb gatherers, or other Wanjin sword sect disciples, was more than within their reach. The pleas ran on only a moment before they were snuffed out, and behind us the mountain went abruptly still. I flashed in front of a fleeing disciple and threw the Starry Night sword shield wide to block a green specter, and Guak Rimsan swept his broadsword level and knocked the thing far off. The disciple thanked him, still shaking, panting hard. Guak Rimsan barked at him not to just stand there, but run. The man woke as from a dream and bolted for the foot of the mountain. The specter we had flung aside did not turn back on us at all, only swallowed a nearby herb gatherer down into its belly. Guak Rimsan ground out for me to go, and I nodded, took his shoulder and ran on. We had not covered a few hundred yards before 2 more green specters came into view ahead, chasing Wanjin's sword sect disciples. Guak Rimsan roared that there were far too many, that the others could never outrun them, and he charged in and hewed one specter away. I shoved the second off with a sword shield, caught the disciple's hand and flashed us clear. There were no herb gatherers left near, or they had already been eaten, so the 2 green specters lunged straight at Guak Rimsan and me. He told me to go first, looking at me. I hesitated, then took the disciple and ran. Guak Rimsan loosed a great shout and drove the Tongwan technique to its limit, his chi and blood surging, his muscles swelling. With giant strength and iron bones, he tore both green specters open, then turned and ran, for several more were coming from far off. That kind of gutting was a mortal wound to a man, but to a specter it only slowed the mending a little. He sprinted out a few hundred yards and caught sight of me holding off 3 green specters, 3 disciples helping at my back. He shouted for the specters to die, every one, his eyes gone bloodshot, blood weeping from the pores of his skin, and he crashed in and battered the 3 aside. Heroic as the sight was, I saw his throat work as he swallowed back a clot of stalled blood, though some still spilled from the corner of his mouth. He turned to me and said to take the disciples away, that he would lead the specters off, or few of us would ever reach the sect. Then he drew a white candle from his robe. Saving them one at a time was hopeless, and the most he could do was pull the pack elsewhere and buy the rest time to flee. I stood stunned. His combat power was there, but his footwork was not, and to bait the specters like this could only end in his death. He laughed and told me to wait for him to come back and drink, then took out a fire starter and lit the white candle, a strange scent curling up as he did. Then he dashed back up the mountain without a backward glance. The other disciples cried his name in disbelief, and the specters that had been about to pounce on them swung all at once toward him instead. I watched his back go, and something struck my mind like a hammer. Why did I cultivate? I had put the question to myself before, and the answer had been to keep from being trodden on, to live well in this world. But if a man came into real power in the martial way, would he lend a hand to the weak when he met them? I had never asked myself that. Or perhaps the thought had come and I had chosen not to look at it. Now watching Guak Rimsan, the question stood squarely before me and would not move. If a man has the strength, does he save? If kin and friends stand in danger, does he save? The muddle in my eyes slowly hardened into something clear. To throw my own life down for another I could not yet do. But if I had strength to spare, then of course I could save. I called for Guak Rimsan to wait, that we would go together, and flashed to catch him up. He froze, then laughed from the belly. The sense of it was plain enough. His footwork alone was the weak point, his combat power anything but, so he could turn aside the blows meant for me. I closed my right hand on the long sword, the Chongsim technique spinning fast, and the nerves in my chest slowly settled. Behind us, the disciples watched the 2 of us go up against the tide, their eyes full of shame and of awe. A green specter rose without a sound at my flank, and a sword shield caught it. I used the force to slide off to the other side, and before it could spring again, I had shaken it in a few strides. Guak Rimsan hacked another sneaking green specter away. We split the work between us, left and right. Several of them lunged, and neither could touch us, for before they could ever close the ring, I had already slipped their grasp and denied them a second chance. We could cut down the far side, Guak Rimsan said, glancing behind. We had gone against the flow less than a mile, and already we had met no fewer than a dozen green specters, with a full score or more chasing us now. Every one of them had been drawn by the white candle and given up on all the other humans, wanting nothing but the 2 of us in that flame. Once they had devoured the candle, they meant to tear us apart alive. I asked which way to go. I did not know the mountain's paths, only the nearest way down, the one everyone was fleeing along now. He pointed right and said a great boulder lay ahead that way. There were many ways off the mountain, some of them long roundabout tracks, and leading the specters they could take exactly those and steer wide of the others. I nodded and looked back. The pack behind kept slowly swelling. Whether it was the moving that did it or not, the specters clung ever tighter to this white candle they could not eat and yet could not stop wanting. Running fast, I thought, truly held every advantage. Leave when you please, stay when you please, even strike them and slip away clean. In a moment I spotted the boulder and sprang up onto it. Guak Rimsan drew a thing from his robe, stepped back a pace and aimed it at me and the green specters storming madly behind. I stared at the object, baffled, and asked what he was doing with the recording stone. He said with a brilliant grin that he was leaving evidence behind, that this would win me a great merit. Into the stone he caught me holding my sword one-handed, the dozens of green specters massed at my back and, above all, the white candle. I could not help a laugh, never having thought Guak Rimson would carry a recording stone about him. I knew the things could not catch sound, ran only a short span, and gave blurred images much as when the Alchemist Alliance had recorded only a few snatches of my assessment. They wore out after a handful of uses besides, dear and fragile and mostly impractical. Had they only lasted longer, this world might have grown a whole different trade around them. I said we should go, with a glance at the distance the green specters had left to close. After the recording stone came out, the air between us had shifted somehow. A moment ago it had been all taut fear, and now, absurdly, it felt like we'd wandered off on holiday. A green specter sprang from somewhere and lunged at me, and I turned my arm a fraction, and a sword shield of pure sword chi flicked it far away. He agreed, tucking the recording stone away with a laugh, and said we should go. I gripped his shoulder and dashed on down the mountain. The green specters were no longer swelling much, 40 or 50 in all, plainly every one that had slipped through, running as one now and trampling one another, a terrible boiling mass. The white candle had burned to its middle, though at my pace half a candle should see us clear to the foot of Sonun City. Lucky it was that Peng Supo and the others held the great specters back, where this baiting run would surely have dragged out a large one. I asked whether we were luring them straight to Sonun City. He nodded that we were, for Sonun City had a warding formation, and once the specters drew near, they were dead without a doubt. I asked him then what a spirit sword was. This baiting trip had been thrilling and yet safe, and I had thought again of the Bio Kriong sword in Peng Supo's hand, the one which had first found the specters out. I looked down at my own long sword. After turning aside the green specters a few times, the refined iron blade had gone corroded, a few more strikes from being scrap. A spirit sword was just a sword with spirit in it, he said after some thought. I near enough tripped over my own feet. Was that not too glib by half? No more than the plain, literal sense of the words? He smiled, seeming to know how thin it sounded, and admitted he did not truly know either, that he had only heard our master mention it now and again. He had gathered it was a weapon only experts of the spirit refining realm could wield, that for men at the body refining realm its proper power stayed shut. He asked whether I did not know of the spirit refining realm. I had heard, I said with a nod, that past the organ refining realm a man who won through could reach the spirit refining realm. He said that was so, only that the name was a loose catch-all one. The realm truly next after was the spirit refining realm, where a cultivator used his spirit to open the body's hidden apertures and draw out more of its potential. A longing crept into his voice. I asked whether our master was in the spirit refining realm, feeling something off, for his aura seemed little different from a common organ refining cultivator's, only a touch deeper. He had been once, Guak Rimsen said, but our master had taken a grave wound later and his realm had fallen back. Still, having stood in the spirit refining realm in his day, he had kept a sliver of its mystic art, which was why he could yet wield the bio-crayon sword. He could not help a sigh. Understanding broke over me all at once, and I was about to say more when a vast noise rolled up from better than 10 miles off, so loud it carried clear across all that distance. We both turned our heads and saw a streak of sword light shoot into the sky, holding a moment before it winked out. I asked quickly whether that was the Bio-Crayon sword. He did not know, he said, shaking his head. It was too far. I said the specters had stopped, looking at the green swarm in the distance. A breath ago they had been huddled and trampling and tearing along, and now they had halted, every one. The wick of the white candle gave a faint muffled crack, and still not a specter stirred. Then a low sharp cry rose from their mouths, and all at once they wheeled about and stormed back up the mountain. Guak Rimson said the lead specter must be hurt, his eyes brightening, calling its underlings back to it, and he blew out what was left of the white candle. I asked whether we were going back to the sect now. He nodded that we were. The sect knew of the trouble here and reinforcements should come soon, so we would go back and wait for our master and the rest. I nodded, and the two of us ran for the mountain gate of the Wanjin sword sect. Because the way down we had taken ran remote, it cost us half an hour to get back. Someone called out that the senior brother was back, and then that junior brother Jin had made it too. What a wonderful thing. And everyone crowded round us, faces bright with relief. It was the gladness of men who had lived through a disaster, for many had thought they would not slip free this time, and here they stood, run back safe. Guak Rimson asked whether everyone had returned, sweeping the crowd and finding a few faces missing. At the question the others fell quiet. So much time had passed, and any not back by now would likely never come back at all. He could not help a sigh. He and I had done all we could. The white candle's reach ran short, and it had not called every last specter at once, so in that gap any man unlucky enough to blunder into a green specter had likely lost his life. An hour on, Peng Supo and a few others came back, everyone hurt, some with an arm torn clean away. Peng Supo himself drenched in blood, though not gravely wounded. Seeing how many of his people had made it home, he looked frankly startled. The specter's tenacity had run past all guessing, many of the lesser ones breaking clean through their guard, and any pursuit had been snarled up by the lead specter. Had the reinforcements not come at the last, there was no telling how many would have lived, and they might have gone down together with that lead specter. Everyone was to rest first, Peng Supo said with a deep sigh, and they would speak of matters tomorrow, and he turned back to his room, while the others drifted apart. The long night dragged, and many a man turned and could not sleep. Early the next morning, when I came to the yard outside Peng Supo's quarters, I found it strangely loud. Voices raised and arguing. Someone was claiming to have been the one to light the white candle and draw the specters off. Moon Jagyom was shouting at senior brother Nagun, his face red. What he himself had seen was Guak Rimson take junior brother Jin, the two of them going against the flow to bait the things. Nagun answered with a rueful smile that he should not work himself up, and that he had only caught wind of it by chance. A certain senior brother saw, he said, had even flaunted a white candle in his hand. Someone put in, asking whether anyone else had seen Sagamdong light a white candle on the mountain. A white candle proved nothing on its own, for who could say where a man had truly lit it? After everyone came back the day before, all of them had said they meant no more specters. When a head count of the herb gatherers was done that morning, a great many turned up alive, 8 and 10 home safe, but for a few hurt from running too hard. Another man shouted in indignation that he too had seen senior brother Guak Rimson and junior brother Jin light white candles and charge back up. He demanded to know what Sagyumdong was playing at, whether he was out to steal the credit. After they had come home, the men had talked it over among themselves. They knew that without the white candles Guak Rimson and I had carried, how many of them lived would have been left to raw luck. Someone had given testimony for Sagyumdong, Nagun said, shaking his head. At the start, only their own party had been sent on the task, and later, on account of the Shineum sect, the sect had dispatched a second group to join them. That so many disciples had lived through the specter calamity was a thing the sect had scarcely looked for, since even Peng Supo's people had come within a breath of being wiped out. By their reckoning, few should have made it back at all, yet most of Peng Supo's party had returned, and a great many of the added group besides. And now, this morning, other disciples were putting it about that Sagyumdong had lit the white candle and pulled the specters away, sparing the disciples and herb gatherers alike. The credit did run high, someone murmured, so it was no wonder a man would reach for it. I asked how many specters this Sagyumdong said he had lured, stepping forward with a smile. They greeted me, saying I had come, and could not help smiling to see me. By now they all knew their safe return owed, apart from Peng Supo's party, in no small part to Guak Rimson and me. To stand fast under that weight and turn back against the tide to bait the specters was a thing most men could not do. Guak Rimson's voice came as he ambled over, agreeing, and asking just how many this Sagyumdong said he had lured. The man had claimed a dozen or so, Nagun said, and that the specters had wounded him, pointing to his own shoulder. Sagyumdong's shoulder had indeed been hurt in that very spot. Moon Jagyom cried out to ask who among them did not carry a few wounds, with the mountain thick with specters at the time, since being hurt was the most ordinary thing in the world. The trouble was that a fair number over there were testifying for Sagyumdong, swearing they had seen him light the white candle to lure the specters. Matters like this were hard to make clear, Nagun said with another shake of his head. Someone said, tense, that they must go and speak up too, and could not let the others take what was ours for nothing. The rest nodded and agreed to go and speak. I asked whether he knew this Sagyumdong. He said after casting his mind back that he did, their cultivation about level, the man a touch arrogant, but his footwork genuinely fine rare among their peers. Baiting specters the day before, footwork was what mattered above all, or the moment the pack swarmed a man, even an organ-refining fighter would be in trouble. With footwork like mine and the starry night sword laid over it, circling those things had run far easier than one would think. A man needed the nerve first, of course, and most, footwork and sword art and all, would simply have run far away. Peng Supo appeared outside the yard and asked what all this racket was about so early in the morning, his face still a shade pale but on the whole sound. Moon Jagyom stepped up and laid the matter before him. Guak Rimson and I had risked our lives to lure the specters the day before, he said, and now someone wanted to snatch the credit for it. Hearing it out, Peng Supo looked at the two of us in surprise. He had been puzzling the day before over why the losses from the spectre calamity fell so far short of what he had feared. He had meant to look into the why of it today. He had never thought it would prove to be his two most accomplished disciples who had staked their lives to light the white candles and draw the specters off. When they had seen the lesser specters flee the day before, Peng Supo and the others had in fact waited lighting a white candle to pen the things in one place. but the lead specter had stood right before them, and a lit candle would only have sent every specter berserk, swarming a single man who would surely have died on the spot. As for using a white candle to bait the lead specter itself, the thing ran so fast that no one could have managed it. He pointed at the two of us, found no words, and in the end sighed. He had been the same in his youth, and it had ended with him gravely wounded and his realm fallen away. He held no regret, only wished his cultivation had run higher at the time. Where his disciples were concerned, though, his hope was that they would not meet danger head-on, but run wherever running was possible. That was the very reason he had taught me the Starry Night Sword and the soul-chasing step. And now, against all his intent, I seem to have used the soul-chasing step to throw myself into danger instead, which left him with nothing to say. Guak Rimson asked whether, when they saw the lesser specters called back, our master had counted how many returned. He did not take it as certain that Sa Gyumdong had lied, for a heart to help one's fellows was not his alone, and Sa Gyumdong met the requirements for the feat. Peng Supo said several dozen, and told him to ask Jian Rimdo who had held them off, since he himself had only glanced. Moon Jiagyong pressed, anxious, asking what they were to do about it, whether they should not hurry and report Guak Rimsan and my doings, or the whole of the credit would fall to Sa Gyumdong. Peng Supo nodded and said the two of us should come with him, that the merit here was no small one, and since we had earned it there was no call for false modesty. A moment later, with Peng Supo leading and Guak Rimson and me behind, we set out for the sect's Sangong Hall. It was the place in the Wanjin sword sect where merits were weighed and rewarded, and punishments handed down. The instant the three of us stepped inside, we found it fairly humming. I looked and saw that all of the junior martial uncles who had been on the mountain the day before, save the one gravely hurt, were present. They were gathered around a few disciples, speaking to them warmly. Guak Rimson murmured that the man there was Sa Gyumdong, turning to me after a glance. It came to me with a jolt. I had not reckoned that Sa Gyumdong and his people had already reached the place, plainly set on claiming the credit for the previous day's specter baiting outright. Jian Rimdo, at the sight of Peng Supo, said his junior brother had come just in time, and pointed at Sa Gyumdong with a smile. He said he had wondered the day before why so few were hurt by the lesser specters. Today they had the reason, thanks to this disciple, who had taken a white candle and drawn the specters off, or the losses would have run heavy. Peng Supo said he had come because these two of his had used white candles to lure the specters the day before as well, and he brought Guak Rimson and me forward as he spoke. The moment the words left him, the Sangong Hall, loud a breath before, fell dead silent. Sa Gyumdong said, hearing Jian Rimdo out, his brows knotting deep and his face gone cold, that he had no need to counterfeit anything. The day before, he insisted he truly had used the white candle to lure the specters. He had not called this disciple a counterfeit, Peng Supo said, shaking his head. He had only meant that his two disciples had used the white candle to lure the specters too, and ought to be credited for it. Falsely claiming a merit was a grave offense. The Sangong Hall deacon said heavily. He had taken the matter for plain and settled, and had not looked for two parties to step forward. Either one of them was false, or both sides had in truth lured the specters, since the day's fallen casualties was a fact past dispute. Jian Rimdo asked, looking at the two of us whether they had anything they wished to say. Sa Gyumdong did not speak, but instead stepped up to stand before me, running his eyes over me head to foot. Feeling that my aura sat only at the bone-forging realm, he frowned a little and turned his head to Guak Rimsan. He remembered, Sa Gyumdong said that footwork had never been senior brother Guak Rimsan's strong suit, and with footwork like that, he feared Guak Rimsan could not have lured those specters away. Guak Rimsan said with a smile that he had indeed been unable to, his footwork truly no better than middling. The chief credit for the matter belonged to junior brother Jin, he said, and he himself had only pointed out the road. Had his footwork been fine enough, he would have gone to bait the specters alone the night before, and never dragged me along into the danger. Sa Gyumdong echoed it, looking at me in surprise. Had Guak Rimsan claimed his own footwork had improved, he might have half believed it, for that talent had never been poor, only bent wholly on the Tongwan technique. Most intersect disciples held the other arts secondary, since once a man lifted his realm, the rest came far simpler from that height. I said it was me, cupping my hands. Sa Gyumdong asked how I could prove it. I laughed and asked how he wanted me to prove it, and how he meant to prove it himself. He laughed that I was actually calling him into question, looked around, and pointed at a small bird a few dozen yards outside the Sangong Hall. He asked how long I thought it would take him to catch it and bring it back. Everyone turned to look, and found a small bird out on the open ground pecking at insects. Charging over from here, if a man spooked the bird, then without a certain grade of footwork, the thing could well take wing before he reached it. One could of course creep over quietly and seize it, but that would prove nothing. I did not think he could catch that bird, I said, with a glance at it and then at Sa Gyumdong. I did not think he could catch it either, Guak Rimson said, laughing from the side. Then he told me to watch closely and see whether he could. He narrowed his eyes, shot me a look, and turned toward the open ground outside, his body dropping into a slight crouch before. The next instant, he darted out. In a few strides, Sagamdong reached the bird, and the bird at last caught the motion and beat its wings to fly. A smile touched his face, and he stretched out his right hand to close on the bird. But before his hand could even reach, another hand arrived a step ahead of his and took the bird first. Sagamdong started and turned and found that it was me. He stood stunned, then clawed on instinct toward where I had been, and where was there any trace of me? Looking up, he saw me already back inside the Sangam Hall, watching him from across the distance. His eyes went slowly wide. Was his opponent not only at the bone-forging realm, and what kind of speed was this? A speed the organ-refining realm itself would scarcely have bettered. And not Sagamdong alone. Everyone else within the Sangam Hall was astonished at the sight of my footwork. Unlike Sagamdong, who had not seen the whole of it, they had watched every step of my going and my catching the bird and my returning, plain as day. Though Sagamdong had set off first, and I had held back a beat before starting, I had still reached the mark ahead of him. On footwork alone, I had crushed him whole. Jean Rindo looked me over a few times and turned to Peng Supo. This disciple had been well recruited, so gifted in footwork. Only his cultivation ran a shade low, still at the bone-forging realm at his age, which was a pity. Peng Supo kept his face empty. He had long known of my footwork, and yet seeing it again today he found it seemed to have grown further still. And how many days had it even been? I let the small bird go and watched Sagamdong walk slowly back. I asked with a smile whether it could be proven now. He demanded, glaring, whether I had deliberately held my cultivation down, feeling himself made a fool of. For how could a bone-forging man own footwork like that? With that time and that strength, would it not have been better to lift his cultivation properly, and the other side must have suppressed his, purely to toy with him? Jin Bi truly stood at the bone-forging realm, Jian Rindo said from the side. He had not suppressed his cultivation. Sagamdong turned to Jian Rindo in disbelief, and at the slight nod his eyes went wide. What manner of monster was this Jin Bi? And did Peng Supo not care at all to let a disciple cultivate his footwork so far past his realm? 100 thoughts raced through him, and yet one fact remained to face. My footwork was faster than his by a long, long way, and should it come to baiting specters, my chance of pulling it off would run far past his own. The other disciples who had come to vouch for Sagamdong were at a loss now. How had it come to look as though Senior Brother Sa were the one claiming false credit? He truly had lit the white candle to lure the specters. He said loudly, and this he had told no lie. Senior Brother Sa truly did light it. One disciple said softly, they would never dare help him lie. Just so, another added, they had only dared come because they had seen it, for they knew the rules of the sect. Guak Rim-san walked up to the Sangong Hall deacon, cupped his hands, and asked Senior Marshal Uncle Jang whether Sagamdong had said how many specters he lured the day before. He had said upward of a dozen, the deacon answered after a moment's recall. Then Guak Rim-san looked at Jian Rimdo and asked how many minor specters had returned to the lead specter's side the day before. There would have been 50 or 60, Jian Rimdo said, thinking it over, though he had not looked closely, and asked why he wished to know. Guak Rim-san said he was doing his sums, because the specters trailing the two of us the day before had numbered around 50. He smiled and walked up to Sagamdong. Sagamdong had said he lured upward of a dozen, he said, while he and junior brother Jin had lured around 50, and the figures did tally. Sagamdong said aghast that they had lured 50 for luring a dozen the day before had all but pushed him to his limit. The others frowned a little. If it truly ran as Guak Rimsan said, then the credit for saving so many disciples the day before should fall in the main to me and my companion. 50 against a dozen was a vast difference. Guak Rimsen asked with a smile whether he did not believe it. Sagamdong said, lifting his head a fraction, that empty words were no proof, and asked whether he could produce evidence. Beaten as he was on footwork, baiting so many specters took more than footwork, and I was only at the bone-forging realm after all. Guak Rimsan apologized, but he actually did have some, and drew the recording stone from his sleeve. He had recorded the images because handing them to the Sangong Hall would carry more weight, and now that someone had come to claim the credit, it proved handy. Sagamdong's eyes flew open at the sight of it. Why would this Guak Rimsan carry a recording stone about, when the things were dear, held only a few images, and ordinary folk almost never touched them? There were, of course, certain wealthy young men who liked their coarser games and would record a scene or two to enjoy at their leisure. Such things did exist. The people present were looking at Guak Rimsan with a good deal of curiosity, which left him feeling rather at sea. This recording stone had been used before to catch some key points of the Tongwan technique our master taught, he explained, uneasy under all the eyes. which was why he carried it. Then he woke the images within. Everyone looked up and saw me holding a long sword, and there, in the light of a white candle, dozens of specters heaped together in the distance. A sight to make the scalp crawl. A rough count put them near 50. Sa Dong turned to look at me and my companion. How had this been done? Those dozen-odd specters the day before had all but killed him, and had the minor specters not been called back at the end, he likely could not have held on. It seemed they had saved his life the day before after all, Jian Rimdo said, looking at Sagum Dong. His own master had been the most gravely hurt of any, the reason he was not here today. When Peng Supo had said my companion and I had lured the specters too, Jian Rimdo had been worried. Now it appeared both sides had reached the same decision, only that Guak Rimson and I had done it the better. Sagyumdong kept his head down, his mind churning. The day before he had truly believed himself the only one gone back to bait the specters, his footwork among the best on the mountain. He had been afraid, but after lighting the white candle only a dozen or so had chased him, far fewer than he had dreaded. Coming home to find so many alive, he had naturally taken it for his own doing. He had never dreamed others had gone too, that they had lured so many and had set a recording stone on it besides. The whole thing was past believing. The Sangong Hall deacon looked on the scene before him with a smile. It had been full of twists and turns from end to end. At the start, he had truly thought some disciple bold enough to lay false claim to a merit, and, as it happened, the whole of it had been nothing but a misunderstanding. Sagyemdong was not the equal of Guak Rimsan or me, and yet even so the man had proven himself remarkable. In the thick of yesterday's danger, he had dared to step forward, baiting the specters with his own movement techniques so the disciples and herb gatherers could keep a path to live. Courage like that, paired with a real sense of responsibility, was the sort of thing the school never left unrewarded. Even had he stayed put, the ending would not have changed. Yet the moment he chose to stand out, the outcome no longer mattered. The lion's share of the credit was still ours, since without the two of us he would have lured better than 50 specters onto himself. With his footwork he could never have shaken them, and once he was torn apart the specters would only have turned to hunt the rest. The Merit Hall deacon spoke in a heavy voice and awarded Sagim Dong 5,000 contribution points for stepping into the danger. Sagim Dong lowered his head and thanked the junior marshal uncle, all his old arrogance gone, still struggling to make sense of everything the day had thrown at him. Then the deacon called Guak Rimsan and me forward, and we cupped our hands. He said that at the critical moment we had thrown our own lives aside to save many disciples and gatherers. By the school's rules, he told us, I was awarded 8,000 points and Guak Rimsan 5,000. We traded a glance and thanked him with a smile, and he waved us off saying there was no need, that this was simply the rule. Master Peng Supo watched his two disciples with a satisfied look, most of all because Guak Rimsan had somehow carried a recording stone through the whole affair, a thing that surprised even him. He had quite forgotten just when his senior disciple had found the moment to record that stone, back when he was being taught the essence of the Tongwan technique. An hour later, I sat in Guak Rimsan's room with a cup of herbal tea and asked whether he had any good ideas for spending the contribution points. He reminded me that I had once asked what it took to enter the school's scripture pavilion. With 8,000 points, he said, I had long since cleared the threshold and could trade them for cultivation techniques inside. Since I was an alchemist, he added I could just as easily trade for pill formulas. Beyond the scripture pavilion, there was the treasure pavilion, which had no threshold at all and dealt in medicinal pills and weapons and the like. My eyes lit up a little. 8,000 points had quietly turned every locked door into an open one. My hunger for new cultivation techniques was not strong just then. The thing that mattered most was raising the Tongwan technique to its 4th level and pushing into the marrow refining realm as soon as I could. Even so, I wanted to walk the scripture pavilion and see what it held, if only to widen my eyes. If something truly fine turned up, I could trade for it later when the need came. Back when my points had not yet reached 1,000, I could not so much as set foot inside. I asked what would become of the herb gathering mission, since we had met the specters and finished less than half of it. His smile faded, and he said the Sionan sword sect cared nothing for what had befallen us, and looked only at results. The school, he judged, would most likely send an elder to sweep the specters from that mountain and see the mission through. When I asked whether our two teams would go again, he shook his head and said the school would send other junior brothers instead. He patted my shoulder and told me to use the time to cultivate the Tongwan technique in earnest and climb to the marrow refining realm quickly. Only a high cultivation could keep a man safe, he said, and there were times when wanting to run and being able to run were two very different things. The Sonon sword sect was overbearing, I thought, frowning, and yet they were the hegemon here, and strength decided everyone's attitude. Whatever displeasure I felt, there was nothing at all to be done about it. Guak Rimson was afraid I would lean on my movement technique and let my martial Dao realm slide. It was true enough that footwork could dodge the greater part of trouble, only the greater part, never all of it. Some straits, once you fell into them, simply meant death. I smiled and told him to rest easy, that I understood, since where the raising of my realm was concerned, I had never once slacked. An hour later, I stood in Seonan City and found Ji-Dokbong looking oddly worn, faint dark circles ringing his eyes. When I had seen him last, he had been perfectly fine, so I asked where he had been and why he looked so drained. He yawned and said he was fine, that with me away there had been no medicinal pills to sell. So he had wandered Seonan City, found the Chuihong Pavilion much to his liking, and gone a few times. He rubbed at his waist and admitted this body of his truly could not keep up, though the look on his face said he fully meant to go back. I could not help laughing. The old glutton had been hollowing himself out in a pleasure house the whole time I was away. I told him to take it easier, and he waved me off and asked why I had come back so early, whether the herb gathering had gone wrong. I nodded and said something had happened, that we had run into the Shinyom sect and a specter disaster, and that I suspected the disaster had been the Shinyom sect's way of paying us back. He frowned at the name, feeling he had heard it somewhere, and after a moment placed it as the sect that had stood against the Sonon sword sect for years. Then he asked how I had managed to provoke them. I told him I did not know, that perhaps it was only because we had been gathering herbs for the Sonon sword sect in the first place. The Shinyom sect's ways had always been hard to read, and it was just as likely that someone else had done the deed and laid it at their door. They were the sort who never minded one more louse on a bald head, taking whatever blame came without a word of protest. Given their black name, even had they explained, no soul would have believed them. I told Ji-Dokbong we would take up the alchemy again in the morning and keep refining Jangbu pills, and that he should send the herbs over as before. He nodded, since it was awkward to refine pills up on the mountain, and the money had been thin of late. In his telling, the Chuihong Pavilion was a fine place, with good food and wine, warm service, lovely women, and any wish granted, its one and only fault being the price. I left the courtyard and stepped into a pharmacy, where the shopkeeper came forward all smiles and asked what I needed. I asked whether he had any medicinal pills that guarded the body's meridians, and he nodded and warned me it ran a little dear. 301 for a single pill. He fetched a bottle from the shelf and set it before me. I lifted the stopper at his leave and let the faint medicinal fragrance rise, my nose twitching as it sorted the herbs apart. He smiled and said I had the eye of an expert, that the meridian pill demanded exacting herbs. The main ingredient alone, stargrass, had to be aged past 20 years, which drove the cost of refining sky high. From the fragrance, I had indeed caught the stargrass, its properties dense and well condensed, and though I could not yet swear to the 20 years, the age was plainly no small thing. I remarked that few people likely bought this pill, and he agreed without hiding anything, saying most customers still went for the internal strength pills, the Jangbu pill and the Biryong pill. I said I would look around a while, and he told me I was welcome to try the other shops, since his price was already the lowest to be had. He had not lied. I walked several of the larger pharmacies in Sonan City, and every one of them sold the Meridian pill at that same price. So in the end, I went back and bought a bottle from him. Rather than return to the school, I stayed on in the rented courtyard. Night fell, and Ji-Dokbong, dark circles and all, warmly invited me to come along. I told him in a grave voice that a place like that ground away a man's spirit and energy, wrecked his will, and stood as a fearsome challenge to any martial Tao cultivation. When he asked me so what, I said with a perfectly straight face that this was exactly why I meant to go and challenge my weakness. He burst out laughing and said, in that case we had better go at once. We threaded the bright crowded streets of Seonan City until we reached a blazing lit restaurant, where the greeting girls at the door wore very little and carried a cool aloofness in place of any smile. The colder they held themselves, the more feverish the men around grew, their eyes crawling over the girls without the least shame. Ji-Dokbong grinned that this was only the door, that the true test waited within, and led me into the Chuihong Pavilion like a man who knew the way by heart. A soft voice welcomed me through, and along the painted walls ran a verse about endless towers and endless revelry, of warm wind and wine that lulled travelers into forgetting where they were. 2 hours later, I came back to the rented courtyard feeling thoroughly refreshed, having failed, alas, to challenge my weakness at all, and so I sat down to cultivate instead. I swallowed the Meridian pill I had bought that day in one go, and it melted the moment it touched my mouth. Cool threads of energy soaked through me while I closed my eyes and drove the Tongwan technique with everything I had. Whether it could truly lift the proficiency of the Tongwan technique rested entirely on whether this 301 pill was worth its price. The internal force wheeled through me at speed, and the grinding friction I usually felt where it scraped my meridians had gone far lighter today, at moments almost beyond noticing. A smile pulled at my mouth, since a man got what he paid for, and these 301 had proven themselves. I gathered my thoughts and bent every scrap of attention onto the circulation of the Tongwan technique. As my mind stilled, the internal force ran faster still, until my skin and flesh began to tremble. 3 hours slipped by before I knew it, the sky outside already paling toward dawn. I opened my eyes, breathed out a lungful of stale air, and could not keep the smile from my face. Diligent as I had always been, forever sitting up late over my internal force technique, my body still had its limits. In the ordinary way, I had to stop and rest after an hour or so. To drive the Tongwan technique at full power for 3 unbroken hours was a thing that had never once happened before. What mattered more was that after those 3 hours, my meridians ached hardly at all, and half an hour's rest would let me carry straight on. The pill had all but doubled my cultivation time. With an effect like that, I judged I would not be parting from these meridian pills for a long while yet. The thought of trading for the formula at the school and refining them myself did cross my mind, only to be thrown out at once. Fine as the pill was, its buyers were far too few. It was not useless to other martial artists, but many would never lay out the coin, not when a Jangbu pill served them better and 301 bought 3 Biryong pills instead. If I went to the trouble of learning it only to save myself a little money, I would have almost no chance to sell it afterward. The ingredients were dear besides, so the profit would be thin. Swallowing 1 meridian pill a day was no real burden for me, not when I could clear better than 1,001 in the same span. It would only slow the pace of my saving and push back the day I reached 50,001 by some while. Half an hour later, Ji Dokbong came back with a large sack of herbs in hand, the circles under his eyes darker if anything than the day before. I looked at him with some amusement and asked whether he might consider showing a little restraint. I had to admit the Chui Hong Pavilion truly was something, letting a man who had been nothing but ordinary in his last life taste such things for once, and the taste was addictive enough. However addictive it was, though, no one should go every single day the way he did, looking now as if he might drop from sheer exhaustion. He bared his yellowing teeth in a grin and said he knew that he had not spent much of late and would save a while before going again. I was about to say more when the sound of children at play drifted over from the neighboring courtyard. Seeing my look, Ji Dokbong said a family had moved in next door a few days back, a large household that had even gone round to the neighbors with small gifts. When I asked where they were from, he said they had not told him plainly, only that they too had fled here from somewhere else. On the road they had met a strange entity, their caravan losing a good many people before they clawed their way clear of the danger. The word strange entity dragged my brows together on their own, since I had run into several such things myself, and only 2 days past had lived through one more. Ji Dokbong lowered his voice and said perhaps they were simply badly shaken, that the household head in particular looked wretched, his color especially poor, as though the fright had never left him. I nodded and asked whether there had always been so many strange entities about. He said of course not, that now there were so many the smaller caravans could not even leave the city, let alone ordinary folk. He poured us each a cup of tea and went on, saying it was like Pyongyang County in the old days. No strange thing had ever stirred on that mountain, he said, and yet in the end the whole county had been swallowed whole. It came down to how troubled the outside world had grown, he said, for the more troubled the times, the more strange entities crawled out of them. When I asked whether the two were truly bound together, he admitted he did not know. The old books he had read once set it down plainly, he said. In ages when the common people were driven to ruin, such things appeared far more often, while in a peaceful and prosperous age nothing stirred at all. I nodded and let the matter drop. After stepping out with him for a bite of breakfast, I came back to the courtyard and set to refining the Jangbu pills. My plan for these last days was to stay in Sonun City until I had polished the 3rd level of the Tongwan technique to perfection, and only then return to the school. The morning went quickly and I handed the finished pills over to Ji Dokbong. As he took them, he suddenly remembered that I had asked him some while back to keep an eye out for any alliance tasks that might suit me, and said one had turned up. My interest stirred at once, since I had set him watching because he was forever going to the Alchemist Alliance for medicine bottles anyway. The Alliance laid a yearly task quota on every alchemist who wished to keep a place within it. Any who went 2 years running without finishing a single task were struck from the rolls, barring some special circumstance. I had thought that if a fitting task appeared, I might clear the quota and bank some contribution points besides, points I could one day trade for pill formulas. At the Wanjin Sword Sect, I could of course trade for pill formulas too, but it was no alchemy school. Its store of formulas was surely thin, above all the ones the Alliance kept to itself. Ji Dokbong recalled that there was a task to refine beauty pills, hedged about with a good many conditions, and that it named an 8th grade alchemist as preferred. A beauty pill surprised me a little, since such a pill was no great trial to make, ranking, if one had to weigh it, only a shade above the Chi blood pill. He said the reward was quite handsome and that I should go take a look if I had the time, and I nodded. Once he had gone out, I listened a moment to the laughter next door, smiled, and left the courtyard myself. I stopped first at the medicine shop for a few more meridian pills, and from there, I made my way to the Alchemist Alliance. Jin Zhonggran brightened at the sight of me and said, with a touch of reproach in her eyes, that I had not come by in a long time. I grinned, thinking the woman had plainly not yet given me up, and when she bowed slightly and asked what I needed, I said I wanted to ask after a task. As we spoke, we came to the counter, and I pointed at the beauty pill notice on the board and asked whether it carried any special demands. A beauty pill, after all, should be nothing much for most alchemists. She said I had a sharp eye, that an ordinary beauty pill was indeed no trouble, but this one was to be refined from a 50-year-old herb, which was why they were being so careful. I could not help repeating the number back to myself, my brows climbing before I could stop them. The herbs for an ordinary beauty pill were common as dirt, growing thick across the hills and plains, and with the refining so simple, the pills sold cheaply too. But let the herb's age climb to 50 years and the beauty pill's potency would leap, since in the end a pill's virtue rode entirely on the properties of its ingredients. It was the very reason a Young pill cultivated a martial artist so well. Its herbs held to a minimum age, and the meridian pill was no different. One rarely heard of a 50-year herb spent on so slight a thing as a beauty pill, and yet with money enough, a great many exceptions could be bought. I said I would take the task. 50-year materials were precious and the work would need a finer hand, but I had already ground the beauty pill formula to great perfection, and even a 100-year herb I could have refined without a flaw. Jin Jongren warned from the side that a fair number of alchemists had already taken this one, so it would likely come down to a contest. I nodded, since the task gave 500 contribution points, generous enough, and the work itself was easy, so it was small wonder so many had reached for it. Under her somewhat reluctant gaze, I left the alliance and went back to the rented courtyard. The sound of children at play next door had faded and turned into the sound of reading aloud. I paid it no mind and went back inside. The beauty pill contest was 3 days off, and through those days my attention stayed fixed on the Tongwan technique. Having lost a stretch of time to going out, I sat down cross-legged, swallowed a meridian pill, and set the Tongwan technique turning. 3 days passed in a blink. Through them I refined pills each morning, and gave the afternoons and evenings, apart from my unbroken daily cultivation, over to grinding the proficiency of the 3rd level. My panel showed the 3rd level of the Tongwan technique standing at 2,589 out of 6,000, close on half. Another 4 or 5 days would carry the technique to perfection, and then I could seek out Master Peng Supo to learn the 4th level. More than that, once the 3rd level reached perfection, I would awaken the first characteristic, giant strength, and my fighting power would climb another rung. It was this very thing, effort that always showed a return, that kept me pressing forward without pause. Of late I had begun to feel the Tongwan technique quicken my internal force's growth, faint still, but real. I found myself looking harder and harder toward what the 4th level might do. To drag my cultivation only just crept into the bone-forging realm, up toward the marrow refining realm. Inside a Zhou family residence in Sonan City, the Zhou family butler stood before a dozen or so alchemists with a smile. He reminded them that when the Alliance posted the mission, they had all known an assessment would come, and that only those who passed it could truly take the task on. An old alchemist muttered that they had best begin, since a man who would not get the task in the end might as well head home early, and the others voiced their agreement. Most of them had reached for the task because it was simple, the reward generous enough, and the trouble slight, so naturally they wanted the thing over and done. The butler dared not slight them and led the lot into a courtyard where a dozen pill furnaces already stood in a neat row, the herbs and the rest laid fully in. He said in a heavy voice that the assessment was very simple, that it too was a matter of refining beauty pills. Whoever's pill proved best in quality and potency, he said, would win the task. No one present raised an objection, for a batch of beauty pills was no bother. And with everything set out already, it was simpler still. I found a place among the crowd, lit my fire, set up the furnace, and looked the nearby herbs over, and finding nothing wrong, tossed the lot in all at once. The others worked in much the same offhand way, and though their hands were not quite so rough as mine, they were not far off it. In a moment the scent of medicine filled the courtyard, and in less than a quarter of an hour I slapped the lid off and drew out the beauty pills. A Zhou family servant hurried forward, took the pills up with great care, and carried them away to another courtyard. And one after another the others' pills came out and went to the same place.